Before we begin tonight, a quick thank you to everyone who left a comment suggesting Sedona as a topic. You asked for this one, and honestly, the deeper we went into the research, the more we understood why. This one is something else, and if you have a moment after listening, please leave us a review on Spotify. It genuinely takes about 10 seconds, and it means the world to this channel. Every single review helps new listeners find us, now. Let's talk about Sedona. There are places on this earth that seem to exist at the edge of the explainable. Places where the light bends differently, where the silence feels loaded, where the rocks themselves seem to watch you. Sedona, Arizona is one of those places, carved from ancient volcanic stone into formations of deep burnt red and amber. It rises from the high desert floor like something that was built rather than grown. A cathedral of geology, patient and enormous, older than almost anything a human being can name, and, for decades, long before the tour buses arrived and the crystal shops opened and the vortex maps were printed and sold, something strange was happening in the sky above those red rocks. Something that was noticed, something that was documented, something that was, in the end, very carefully not talked about. Tonight, we follow that thread. We go back to the late 1980s, when the first clusters of reports began to surface. We examine the pattern that emerged over the following decades, the repeated sightings, the identical descriptions from independent witnesses, the gaps in official data that should not exist, and the slow, methodical work of one investigative journalist who began to suspect that Sedona was not simply a strange place where strange things happened by accident. We follow his conclusion that Sedona may be a monitored zone, a location where something experimental, extraterrestrial, or something we don't have a clean category for yet, has been appearing with consistency for more than 40 years, and where the official response has been not investigation, but containment. This is the story of the Sedona Zone. Act 1. The sightings begin to understand what Sedona became. You first have to understand what it was. For most of the 20th century, Sedona, Arizona was a small, quiet town. A collection of motels, a few art galleries, a population of a few thousand people who had chosen remoteness over convenience. The surrounding landscape was dramatic, certainly, but drama in the American Southwest is not unusual. Red Rock country stretches across Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona in vast and humbling arrangements. Sedona was beautiful. It was not famous. That began to change in the 1970s and early 80s, when a loose network of New Age spiritual practitioners began identifying what they called vortex sites around the town, specific geographic locations where they believed the Earth emitted unusual energy fields, where meditation felt different, where the body felt charged or heavy or unburdened in ways that resisted easy description. Bell Rock, Cathedral Rock, Airport Mesa, Boynton Canyon. These were the sites most frequently cited. They were also, coincidentally or not, the sites that would become the most consistently associated with the aerial phenomena reports that followed. But in the early 1980s, that connection had not yet been made. The vortex idea was spiritual tourism. The aerial phenomena were something separate, and something that most people in Sedona either hadn't seen yet, or weren't yet talking about openly. By the middle of the decade, that changed. The first documented clusters of sightings in and around Sedona began appearing in local newspapers sometime around 1986 and 1987. The reports were varied in their details, but consistent in their core descriptions. Witnesses reported glowing orbs, typically white or amber or pale blue, moving silently through the night sky at altitudes that were difficult to estimate. They moved slowly, then stopped. Some hovered in place for minutes at a time. Some changed direction without any visible arc or deceleration, the kind of instantaneous course correction that no aircraft in civilian or military inventory was publicly known to be capable of. Some simply vanished. Not faded, not flew away. Vanished, as though a switch had been thrown. Local radio stations began receiving calls. The Sedona Red Rock News and similar regional publications ran brief mentions, generally framed with the cautious skepticism that newspapers apply to any topic that risks their credibility. Flares, they said. Helicopters from nearby military ranges. atmospheric reflections off the rock formations on clear, cold desert nights. These were reasonable explanations, and for a time they were accepted. But the frequency was increasing. That was the thing that the standard explanations couldn't fully account for. Flares happen in clusters. Helicopters have schedules. Atmospheric anomalies are irregular by nature. What was happening in Sedona was neither irregular nor explained by schedules. It was consistent, and in the years that followed, it would become more so. Act 2. The pattern takes shape. Between 1990 and 1993, the reports coming out of Sedona began to attract a different kind of attention. Not from government agencies or official investigators, not publicly anyway, but from within the community of people who took such reports seriously. Civilian researchers, amateur astronomers, members of loosely organised UFO investigation networks that had been operating since the 1950s. They came to Sedona, talked to witnesses, set up cameras, and what they found surprised even them. The witnesses, and there were many by this point, dozens in the immediate Sedona area and more in the surrounding towns of Cottonwood, Cornville, and the Verde Valley, were describing not just similar phenomena, but identical phenomena. 3 lights forming a triangle. That description appeared again and again in report after report, from witnesses who had no contact with each other, who had submitted their accounts independently, who in several cases were unaware that anyone else had reported anything similar. 3 lights in a triangular arrangement, moving slowly, silently, then accelerating upward with a speed that witnesses consistently described as impossible. Not fast, impossible. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, and the sky was empty. A retired aviation technician who had spent 20 years working with military aircraft at Tucson's Davis-Monthan Air Force Base reviewed several witness accounts at the request of a civilian researcher in 1992. His assessment was direct. He said that based on the described behaviour, the silence, the instantaneous acceleration, the hovering stability, none of it matched anything in the known American arsenal at that time. He was careful not to speculate beyond that. He simply said, that wasn't anything we had in the skies back then. 5 words that carry an enormous amount of weight when they come from someone who spent 2 decades surrounded by the things that actually were in the skies back then. Arizona as a whole was becoming a hotspot. Sightings in Prescott, reports near the Mogollon Rim, strange lights over the White Mountains, and then, in March of 1997, an event that would force the entire conversation into the national media, the Phoenix Lights. Thousands of witnesses across a corridor stretching from the Nevada border to the outskirts of Tucson reported a massive, silent V-shaped formation of lights moving slowly across the sky. The governor of Arizona made jokes about it on television. The military said flares, the witnesses, among them, commercial pilots, police officers, and physicians, said otherwise. The Phoenix Lights became the most widely witnessed mass UFO event in American history, and it happened in Arizona, in the same region, in the same sky, where the Sedona reports had been accumulating for a decade. That was not lost on the people who were paying attention. Act 3. The official explanation. Let us give the official position its due. Arizona is, without question, one of the most militarily active states in the American Southwest. The United States Air Force operates Luke Air Force Base just outside Phoenix, where fighter pilots have been trained for decades, where the skies above the desert are routinely occupied by aircraft performing maneuvers that a casual observer on the ground might reasonably find difficult to explain. Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Fort Huachuca south of Tucson. The Barry M. Goldwater Range, an enormous military operating area stretching across the southwestern corner of the state, where live-fire exercises and experimental flight tests take place on a regular basis. Arizona's vast, flat, sparsely populated desert makes it ideal for military aviation. More training, more testing, more flying happens in that sky than in almost any comparable geography in the country. This is genuinely relevant. It is not a fabrication designed to dismiss public concern. Military aircraft do strange things. Experimental prototypes behave in ways that defy easy categorization from the ground. Flares dropped at altitude in still air can appear to hover. Classified programs produce classified aircraft, and classified aircraft, by definition, cannot be publicly acknowledged even when they are observed. The Air Force's public explanation for the vast majority of Arizona sightings, training exercises, experimental aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, flares, is not inherently dishonest. It is, in many specific cases, almost certainly accurate. The problem is not any single explanation. The problem is the pattern of explanation. Because the template was the same every time. Reports emerge, witnesses speak publicly, a brief media cycle follows, the military or the FAA issues a statement, terse, confident, conclusive. The media cycle ends, no follow-up investigation, no formal interview of witnesses, no acknowledgement that the reports had been received or were being evaluated. Just the statement and then silence. Case closed, publicly. And in the space of that silence, the questions accumulated. Because if all of these events were explained by known military operations, why were there no corroborating records? Why were the training schedules not released to confirm the timing? Why did the explanations consistently arrive quickly and leave no room for the possibility that anything unexplained had occurred, even when the witnesses included professionals with expert knowledge of aviation who were saying, on the record, that the explanations didn't hold up? The official position was not wrong necessarily, but it was incurious in a way that felt deliberate, and it was that incuriosity that caught the attention of Daniel Reyes. Act 4. The Investigator. Daniel Reyes was not a UFO enthusiast. That is important to understand. He was an investigative journalist who had spent most of his career covering land use disputes in the American Southwest, water rights litigation, the complicated politics of federal land management in states where the federal government controls enormous percentages of the total land area. He had covered stories that required him to read FAA documents, Department of Defense reports, Bureau of Land Management filings, and the dense bureaucratic language that federal agencies use to describe their activities in the regions they control. He was, in other words, fluent in the kind of paper trail that most people have neither the training nor the patience to follow. He came to Sedona, not as a believer, but as a reporter. A contact had mentioned the consistency of the long-term sighting reports, and Reyes, whose journalistic instinct was to follow patterns rather than individual incidents, drove out to the Red Rock country on a Tuesday afternoon in the late 1990s with a notebook and no particular expectation. He expected to find enthusiastic locals, a few dramatic stories, and a collection of photographs that could have been anything. He expected, in other words, to find nothing that would hold up under scrutiny. What he found instead was the airspace anomaly. Reyes was methodical. Before he talked to a single witness, he sat down with FAA sectional charts for the Sedona area, the kind of detailed airspace maps that pilots use to navigate controlled and restricted airspace. What he saw surprised him. Sedona sits within a complex airspace environment. The Phoenix Terminal Control Area extends considerably to the south and east. Military. Operations areas and restricted zones are distributed across the region in overlapping layers. The geometry of controlled airspace around Sedona is, to put it plainly, unusual for an area with no major commercial airport and a relatively small civilian population. There were corridors and intersections and transition zones that, to Reyes's eye, suggested something more deliberate than the organic growth of airspace management around civilian aviation needs. And then he requested the radar data. For the sighting-heavy years of the early 1990s, 1990, 91, 92, Reyes submitted formal requests for publicly accessible radar records covering the Sedona area. What he received was incomplete, not missing entirely, not obviously redacted, simply incomplete. Gaps in the data. Periods of minutes or sometimes longer where the record simply didn't exist, where the timestamp jumped and the log continued as though nothing had happened in the interval. Reyes requested clarification. He received a response that cited data storage limitations of the era, equipment maintenance schedules, and a note that complete records for many rural areas from that period were not retained in accessible archives. The response was professionally worded, bureaucratically impeccable, and thoroughly unsatisfying. Because Reyes, being thorough, had also requested radar data from comparable rural areas in the same region for the same time period, and those records were complete. Act 5. The witnesses. With the paperwork questions unresolved and the airspace anomaly documented in his notes, Reyes turned to the witnesses. He had expected this part of the investigation to be the least reliable. Anecdotes are by nature subjective, and the literature on eyewitness testimony is not encouraging about its accuracy under normal conditions, let alone conditions involving unusual stimuli in dark desert skies. He had built in a significant discount for the human tendency to pattern match and dramatise. What he encountered shrank that discount considerably. He tracked down long-term residents, people who had lived in and around Sedona for decades. He found retired school teachers and former rangers and small business owners, people with no particular investment in the subject, no books to sell, no reputations built on being witnesses. He interviewed them separately, without sharing details from other accounts, taking careful notes about what they described before asking any follow-up questions that might have prompted them toward particular answers. The consistency was, in Reyes's own words, uncomfortable. Independent witnesses describing events separated by years, sometimes by a decade or more, produced accounts that aligned in their core details with a precision that pure coincidence could not comfortably explain. The triangular formation of lights appeared in accounts from the late 1980s, from the middle of the 1990s, from the early 2000s. The same formation, the same silence, the same behaviour, slow approach, sustained hover, instantaneous departure, different witnesses, different nights, different years, same description. And perhaps most striking of all, the same locations. Bell Rock, the area above and around Cathedral Rock, the corridor between Airport Mesa and Boynton Canyon. These were not random points scattered across the sky. These were specific sites, and across 4 decades of reports, they appeared with a frequency that suggested not randomness but pattern. One witness, a former tour guide who had been leading hikes through the Sedona Red Rocks for almost 25 years, told Reyes something that stayed with him. She said, it wasn't random. They came back to the same spots. She had seen the lights herself on 3 separate occasions spanning more than a decade. Each time, the location was the same. Each time, the behaviour was the same. And she was clear that she wasn't speaking metaphorically or emotionally. She was describing an observable, repeatable geographic fact. The same spots, over and over again, across a span of time that no training exercise or weather event or optical illusion could plausibly account for. Reyes sat with that for a long time. ACT Zix. The Vortex Correspondence. There is a moment in any serious investigation when you encounter a piece of information that you would rather not take seriously, because taking it seriously requires you to revise assumptions you are fairly comfortable with. For Reyes, that moment came when he mapped the sighting locations against Sedona's famous vortex sites. Sedona's vortex sites are officially a spiritual concept. The claim, made by New Age practitioners beginning in the 1970s, is that certain geographic locations around Sedona emit unusual energetic fields that can be felt by people who are sufficiently attuned to them. Bell Rock, Cathedral Rock, Airport Mesa, Boynton Canyon. These are the 4 most commonly cited vortex locations. They attract hundreds of thousands of visitors every year, many of whom report experiences they describe as powerful, disorienting, emotionally charged, or physically strange. The scientific community does not endorse the concept of vortex energy. No confirmed, reproducible physical measurement of any unusual energy field at these sites has been published in a peer-reviewed context. The vortex designation is, in the scientific consensus, a cultural phenomenon rather than a physical one. Reyes accepted that consensus. He was not investigating the vortexes, he was investigating aerial phenomena. But when he plotted the geographic coordinates of the most frequently reported sighting locations on a map, and then overlaid Sedona's documented vortex sites, the correspondence was not subtle. The majority of sighting reports, not some, not a plurality, but the clear majority clustered within a few miles of one or more of the 4 primary vortex locations. Bell Rock appeared at the centre of an extraordinary concentration of reports. Cathedral Rock was second. The spatial overlap between the sighting cluster map and the vortex site map was precise enough that it could not be easily dismissed as coincidence. Reyes was careful about what to make of this. He did not conclude that the vortexes were real in the New Age sense, or that energy fields were attracting or enabling whatever was appearing in the sky. But he noted, and he noted it at length, that the overlap was consistent, that across decades of independent reports from witnesses who were not in communication with each other, and who were not, for the most part, participants in vortex tourism, the geographic pattern held. Something about those specific locations kept appearing in the data. Whatever it meant scientifically, or didn't mean, it was a fact of the record, and facts of the record Reyes believed deserved to be followed. He began to develop a theory. It started, as his best theories always did, with a question. What do these specific locations have in common? Not spiritually, geologically. Act 7. The Contact Zone Hypothesis. Sedona's geology is extraordinary by any measure. The red rock formations that define its landscape, the buttes, mesas, spires, and canyons that rise from the high desert floor in shapes that seem too deliberate, too architectural to be purely natural, are composed primarily of Schneebly Hill sandstone, a formation laid down approximately 300 million years ago in what was then a shallow sea. Layered on top of that are formations of Coconino sandstone, Torowep limestone, and Kaibab limestone. The red coloration that gives the rocks their dramatic appearance and their name comes from iron oxide, rust, essentially, bound into the sedimentary matrix. It is an iron-rich landscape in a profound and measurable sense. Iron is electrically conductive. Concentrated iron-bearing rock formations can produce localized variations in magnetic field strength. This is not speculative. It is measurable geophysics, documented in multiple studies of mineralogically active regions around the world. Whether the variations at Sedona's specific vortex sites are large enough to affect radio frequency propagation, radar return characteristics, or the behaviour of electronic systems at altitude is a different question, and one that Reyes, not a geophysicist, was careful not to answer definitively. But he noted the possibility. He noted that certain researchers in the field of geomagnetic anomaly study had flagged the Sedona Basin as an area of unusual magnetic signature. He noted that the relationship between electromagnetic terrain and radar reliability is well documented in other military contexts, that certain types of geological formations can create interference zones, shadow zones, areas where radar coverage is degraded, or where ground clutter returns complicate the picture. And he asked the question that gave his theory its shape. What if the geographic concentration of sightings around specific Sedona locations was not coincidental or mystical but electromagnetic? What if something about those specific geological formations created conditions, reduced radar visibility, specific electromagnetic characteristics, unusual propagation environments that made them attractive to whatever was appearing in the sky? Either because those conditions allowed unknown aerial vehicles to operate with reduced detection risk, or because those conditions were what the vehicles were responding to in the first place. This was the contact zone hypothesis. In Reyes's formulation, Sedona was not merely a place where strange things happened to occur. It was a location with specific physical properties that made it predictable, a reliable geography that, for reasons that might be electromagnetic or navigational or something we don't have adequate instruments to measure, consistently attracted or enabled the phenomena being reported. Not a spiritual vortex, not a mystical convergence, a physical anomaly zone, one that could be mapped, tracked and monitored. And if it could be monitored by Reyes with publicly available geological and airspace data, then it had almost certainly been monitored by agencies with access to far more complete information long before he arrived. Act 8. The response pattern. Reyes spent several months comparing the Sedona incident record against other documented UFO hotspots across the United States. He looked at the Hudson Valley sightings of the 1980s, which produced hundreds of credible reports of large, silent triangular craft over New York and Connecticut over a span of years. He looked at the Yakima Indian Reservation in Washington state, where a long-serving fire lookout named Bill Vogel had documented hundreds of anomalous light events over multiple decades beginning in the 1970s. He looked at the Marfa lights in West Texas, the Hessdalen lights in Norway, the Gulf Breeze events in Florida, and the long record of unusual aerial activity over the Pine Bush area of New York's Hudson Valley. Each location had its own specific character. Each had a different set of reported phenomena, a different geographic context, a different community of witnesses. But the official response to each of them followed a template so consistent that Reyes began to think of it less as a coincidence and more as a protocol. The template worked like this. Initial reports would surface in local media. Witnesses would come forward. A brief period of public attention would follow, sometimes drawing national media interest if the reports were dramatic enough or the witness credentials were sufficiently compelling. Then an official statement would appear from the Air Force, the FAA, a local law enforcement agency, or some combination of official voices, providing a definitive explanation. The explanation was always mundane: flares, weather balloons, natural gas, military exercises, lens flare, temperature inversions, conventional aircraft. The explanation was delivered with the confident finality of an institution that has investigated thoroughly and found nothing remarkable, and then the investigation stopped. Officially, no follow-up, no public disclosure of what investigation, if any, had actually been conducted. No formal response to the witnesses who disputed the official explanation. No acknowledgement that the phenomena had occurred with sufficient consistency to warrant ongoing study. Just the statement, the explanation, and the silence. Reyes documented this template across a dozen locations spanning 4 decades. The similarities were not incidental. They suggested to him not a coordinated conspiracy in the dramatic sense, not men in dark suits, making telephone calls in the night, but something more institutional and more mundane. A policy. A default response pattern that had been established at some point, for some reason, and was being applied consistently across a wide range of situations that shared certain characteristics. A policy that prioritized the appearance of explanation over the substance of investigation. He began to think about why such a policy might exist, and that led him to a retired defense contractor named Martin. Act 9. The retired officer, Martin, Reyes used only his first name in his published account, and we all respect that, was in his late 60s when Reyes found him, living quietly in a small town in the White Mountains of Arizona, about 2 hours east of Sedona. He had worked for a defense contractor that held federal contracts in the Southwest during the 1980s and 1990s, doing work he described broadly as involving analysis of aerial surveillance data for military clients. He was not an aviator. He was not a scientist. He was an analyst, someone who processed and interpreted data, who was paid to look at information and make sense of it. He agreed to speak with Reyes on the condition that certain specifics would not be published. The name of the contractor, the exact nature of his work, the specific clients he served. Reyes agreed to these conditions. What Martin was willing to say, he said carefully, and with the particular economy of someone who has spent years in an environment where saying the wrong thing has real consequences. He confirmed, first, that the aerial phenomena occurring in the Arizona region during the years of his employment had been noted by the agencies and contractors he worked with. This was not breaking news in any dramatic sense. It would be more surprising if professional analysts of aerial surveillance data had somehow failed to notice what hundreds of civilian witnesses were observing and reporting. But it mattered that he confirmed it, because it ruled out one of the more comfortable dismissive explanations, that the official agencies simply hadn't seen anything because there was nothing to see. They had seen it, they were aware of it, and they had, Martin said, categorized it. Certain regions, he explained, and Sedona was among the examples he offered, had been internally designated as what he called low visibility zones. His description of what that meant was careful, and, to Reyes, telling. These were areas where unusual aerial activity had been observed, documented, and then placed in a category that did not trigger standard intercept or engagement protocols. The activity was monitored, it was logged, but it was not engaged. It was watched from a distance, and the watching was kept internal. Observation, not engagement. That was the phrase he remembered. Observation, not engagement. He said it was used when the subject of these zones came up, internally. He didn't know what it meant strategically. He wasn't in those meetings. He wasn't at that level. But he remembered the phrase because it was unusual. You didn't hear that kind of framing in normal operational contexts. It implied a deliberate choice not to act, and a deliberate choice not to act implies an awareness of what you're choosing not to act on. Reyes pressed him on what the entities being observed might have been. Martin was clear that he did not know. He was an analyst working with specific data sets, not someone with access to classified assessments or theoretical frameworks for what was being observed. He had opinions, naturally. Everyone who works around these things develops opinions, but he offered them as exactly that, and declined to have his opinions published as facts. What he offered as a fact was the protocol. Observe and do not engage. Watch and do not confirm. Log and do not publicise. Reyes left that interview in the White Mountains and drove back towards Sedona in the dark, through the ponderosa pines and the high desert scrub, with the phrase turning over in his mind. Observation, not engagement. It implied something being observed that was significant enough to monitor continuously, for decades, across multiple locations, without any public acknowledgement that the monitoring was happening. It implied, if you followed the logic to its conclusion, that the agencies responsible for American airspace had made a determination about what they were observing. Not that it was explainable and uninteresting, but that it was complex enough that engaging with it or publicising it was not the preferred course of action. That was a different kind of secret from the ones people usually imagine. Act 10. The Satellite Gap. Reyes spent the better part of a year after his conversation with Martin attempting to find corroborating evidence for the low visibility zone framework through publicly accessible channels. He was not trying to prove extraterrestrial contact. That was never his thesis. He was trying to establish whether the monitoring protocol Martin had described left any detectable footprint in the official record. The satellite data was his most productive avenue. Through the Freedom of Information Act and through contact with civilian researchers who had spent years navigating the same bureaucratic corridors, Reyes gained access to catalogues of available satellite tracking data for the Sedona area going back to the late 1980s. What he was looking for was coverage gaps, periods where the data record was incomplete or absent during the years, and at the times when the highest concentrations of sighting reports had occurred. He found them. Not in every case, and not in a pattern so clean that it could only have one interpretation, but in a frequency that was difficult to dismiss. Specific nights in the early 1990s, nights that corresponded when Reyes cross-referenced against the civilian sighting records he had assembled, with periods of unusually high reported activity, showed incomplete satellite tracking records for the Sedona region. The data existed up to a point, and then it did not exist, and then it resumed. Gaps. Not long ones in most cases, minutes sometimes, but consistent in their timing, consistent in their geographic specificity. The official explanation, when Reyes sought one, was exactly what it had been for the radar data. Storage limitations of the era, record-keeping practices of the time did not always ensure complete archiving. Rural and low-traffic areas were lower priority for data retention. This was a plausible explanation. Data management in the early 1990s was genuinely imperfect, and gaps in records from that period exist for any number of ordinary reasons. But Reyes had done his comparative research. He had pulled equivalent records for comparable areas, similar geographic, character, similar distance from major population centres, similar levels of official aerial activity, from the same time period. Those records were not complete in every case, but their gaps did not correspond to high activity periods. They were distributed across time in the way that technical failures distribute themselves, without pattern, without timing correlation, without the particular quality of appearing at precisely the moments when, according to independent civilian observers, something unusual was happening in the sky. A gap in data that corresponds to a period of unusual reported activity is not proof of anything. Reyes never claimed it was, but it is a fact of the record that raises a specific and uncomfortable question. If the gaps are genuinely random technical artifacts, why do they cluster where and when they do? And if they are not random, what does that mean about the process by which records for those specific moments became unavailable? Act 11. The controlled narrative. By the time Reyes assembled his findings into a coherent framework, he had moved away from the question that drives most UFO investigation. He was not trying to answer whether the objects being seen over Sedona were extraterrestrial. He had concluded early in the process that this question was both unanswerable, with the evidence available, and, in a certain sense, beside the point. What interested him was the response, not what was in the sky. What happened on the ground when people reported seeing it? His conclusion was this: Sedona represented a location where three things intersected in an unusual way. The first was natural geography, geological formations with electromagnetic properties that created a measurably unusual environment for aerial operations, radar propagation, and possibly other physical phenomena that we understand imperfectly. The second was military activity, the proximity to multiple major Air Force installations, the complex airspace geometry, the possibility that some percentage of what was being observed was indeed experimental or classified military technology operating in a region that offered natural cover in the form of remote terrain and convenient official explanations. The third was something else, a residual category of phenomena that fit neither natural atmospheric explanation nor known military technology, that had been reported by credible witnesses with consistent specificity across 4 decades, and that had been the subject of official monitoring protocols that were not publicly acknowledged. The intersection of these three things created what Reyes called a controlled narrative environment. When sightings were reported, the military activity explanation was available and credible, because military activity genuinely did occur in the region. When the military activity explanation was applied, it covered not just the sightings it legitimately explained, but also the sightings it didn't. The residual category, the third element, the presence of genuine explicable phenomena, provided cover for the discussion of phenomena that weren't explicable by the same means, and the consistent application of official explanation, followed by official silence, ensured that the residual category never accumulated enough public attention to force a more detailed reckoning. This was not, in Reyes's analysis, a conspiracy in the Hollywood sense. It was not a group of individuals consciously deciding to deceive the public about alien contact. It was something more institutional and, in a way, more troubling, a default preference for the appearance of explanation over the reality of uncertainty. A bureaucratic tendency to close files rather than leave them open, to apply the available explanation rather than acknowledge that the available explanation was incomplete, not malice, not a cover-up of a specific discovered truth. Something closer to a systematic avoidance of a question that nobody in an official position wanted to be the one responsible for answering. Because to answer it honestly would require acknowledging something that official institutions are structurally ill-equipped to acknowledge, that there are things happening in the sky over American territory that we have been observing for decades, that our best explanations do not fully account for, and that we have chosen, as a matter of institutional policy, to describe as explained rather than to describe as unknown. An unknown is, for a certain kind of institution, the most dangerous word in the lexicon. Act 12. The last question. There is a particular kind of silence that surrounds certain subjects in official discourse. It is not the silence of ignorance, of agencies and institutions that genuinely have no information. It is the silence of awareness that has been converted, through a combination of policy and preference and institutional inertia, into the performance of ignorance. It is the silence of the file that was opened and then closed without notation, the record that exists somewhere in an archive that will not be easily accessed, The conversation in a conference room somewhere in the Arizona desert in the early 1990s where someone looked at a map with a cluster of data points around Bell Rock and said, "Observation, not engagement. Let's see what it does." If Sedona is a monitored anomaly zone, if the contact zone hypothesis is correct in its essential outline, then the monitoring has been ongoing for the better part of half a century. That means that somewhere, in some form, there is a record. Not necessarily a record that says aliens, almost certainly not a record that says that, but a record that acknowledges the anomaly, that documents the consistency of the phenomena, that catalogues 40 plus years of something appearing over the red rocks of northern Arizona and behaving in ways that the available explanations cannot fully account for. And if such a record exists, if the phenomena are real, and the monitoring is real, and the low visibility zone designation is real, then the question that Reyes found himself returning to at the end of his investigation was not the question most people would expect. It wasn't. Are UFOs real? It wasn't. Are we alone? These felt, to him, like the wrong level of abstraction. The question that the Sedona data raised, with its 4 decades of consistent reports, its identical witness descriptions, its same geographic locations appearing again and again across the full span of the record, was something more specific and, in a way, more unsettling. Why do they keep coming back to the same place? Because if the phenomena are real, and if they have been returning to the same geographic coordinates for 40 years, then whatever is happening in Sedona is not random. It is not accidental. It is not the kind of thing that can be explained by atmospheric quirks or military schedules or the human tendency to find patterns in noise. Something has been drawn to that specific stretch of red rock desert, repeatedly and consistently, across a span of time that encompasses enormous changes in the surrounding world. The town has grown, the roads have improved, the tourism industry has transformed the local economy, the population has quadrupled, satellite coverage of the region has become comprehensive, the sky above Sedona is more observed now, in more ways, than at any previous point in human history. And the sightings have continued. Not at the pace of the peak years, perhaps, not with the dramatic frequency of the early 1990s, but they continue. Visitors standing on Bell Rock at dusk, hoping for a spiritual experience, look up and see something moving in a way that the available aircraft in the sky do not move. Long-term residents who have seen the sky above these formations for decades describe encounters that they can't account for and mostly don't discuss publicly anymore, because they've learned what the public response looks like. Hikers on Cathedral Rock trails pull out their phones and record lights that vanish before they can be identified. The videos circulate briefly, get explained away, and disappear from the conversation. The pattern hasn't stopped. The official answer hasn't changed. And somewhere in the space between those two facts, in that particular persistent silence, the real investigation is probably still ongoing, in rooms we don't have access to by people who know more than they are able to say. Epilogue. Today, Sedona is a thriving tourist destination. The population has grown substantially since the first sighting reports of the 1980s, and the town now receives millions of visitors each year. They come for the landscape, for the spiritual experiences, for the pink jeep tours and the art galleries and the restaurants and the astonishing desert light that turns the red rocks 100 different shades of amber and copper and burgundy as the sun moves across the sky. They come to hike Cathedral Rock and to stand on the rim above Bell Rock and to feel, if they're open to it, whatever the vortex sites offer to those who seek them out. Photographers set up their tripods before dawn and capture images that look, when they're successful, like paintings from another world. Families walk the trails, couples watch the sunset from Airport Mesa. The red rocks glow in the evening light in colours that seem too saturated to be real, and the sky above them deepens from pale blue to indigo to the absolute star-dense black of high desert night, and it is beautiful in the way that very few places on Earth are beautiful, with the specific, overwhelming beauty of deep geological time made visible, of ancient stone shaped by forces and across timescales that dwarf anything in the human record, and occasionally someone looks up and sees something they cannot explain, a light that moves wrong, a formation that doesn't correspond to any aircraft they know, a shape that is there and then is not there, and leaves them standing on the trail with the particular mixture of wonder and unease, and almost understanding that dozens of witnesses before them, stretching back across 4 decades, have also felt in this same spot, under this same sky. They pull out their phones, they try to record it. Sometimes they do, and the recording shows something ambiguous that can be explained in multiple ways. Sometimes the object is gone before the camera is ready. Sometimes they watch it for what feels like a long time, long enough to be certain of what they're seeing, and then it accelerates upward and is gone, and the sky is empty, and the red rocks are silent, and the stars continue their ancient indifferent burning overhead. They walk back to town. They think about it for a while. Some of them tell people and some of them don't. The ones who do tell people encounter the same responses that witnesses have always encountered. Reasonable skepticism, gentle mockery, the quick recourse to standard explanation. And most of them eventually do what human beings do with experiences that don't fit the available frameworks. They set it aside, they move on, they continue their lives. But they don't forget what they saw. That's the consistent detail in the accounts. Decades later, witnesses who saw lights over Sedona in 1991 can describe what they saw with a clarity and specificity that ordinary memories don't maintain. It stayed with them in a way that unusual experiences do when they resist the explanations available to us. When the mind can't file something properly, it keeps returning to it, turning it over, looking for the angle that makes it fit. And if something has been appearing over Sedona for more than 40 years, returning to the same coordinates, following the same patterns, drawing the same silence from the same institutions, then whatever it is not waiting for us to figure it out. It is simply there, and then gone, and then there again. Patient, consistent, indifferent to our frameworks. Whatever is happening in Sedona is not random. That much at least the record makes clear, and not random means something. Not random means it has a reason. Not random means that somewhere, in some form of awareness that we may or may not be equipped to recognize, the red rock desert of northern Arizona matters. The question is why? And the silence that surrounds that question, deep, institutional, decades long, suggests that someone, somewhere, may already know. Before we begin tonight's investigation, I want to give a quick shout out to Ilwyn Eventually for suggesting this story idea. If you have ideas for future Sleep Theories episodes, conspiracy theories, unsolved mysteries, strange phenomena you think deserve a deeper look, drop them in the comments below. Some of the best stories we've covered came directly from you, and we really try and read every single suggestion. Now, let's begin. There are places on Earth that feel wrong, not dangerous, not hostile, just wrong. Devil's Tower is one of them. Rising 867 feet above the Wyoming grasslands, it dominates the landscape like a broken tooth jutting from the Earth's jaw. The Lakota people called it Matotipila, Bear Lodge. Geologists call it an igneous intrusion. Tourists call it stunning. but stand at its base as the sun sets and the temperature drops, and you'll feel something else entirely. You'll feel watched. The tower doesn't look like a mountain. Mountains have slopes, curves, the organic chaos of tectonic violence. Devil's Tower looks carved, deliberate. Its hexagonal columns rise in perfect vertical symmetry, too precise to feel accidental, too uniform to feel natural. It looks like architecture. More specifically, it looks like a stump. Not metaphorically, not poetically. Literally, as though some impossibly massive tree was severed at ground level, its wood petrified into stone over millennia, its roots still buried somewhere beneath the Wyoming soil. Most people dismiss this idea immediately. It's pseudoscience, geological fantasy, the fever dream of conspiracy theorists who see patterns where none exist. But here's the thing about Devil's Tower that nobody mentions in the visitor brochures. The locals don't just fear the height, they fear what happens there after dark. Park rangers enforce strict closure policies after sunset. Official explanation: safety concerns, wildlife protection, sacred site preservation. Reasonable enough, but ask anyone who's lived in the shadow of that tower for more than a decade, and they'll tell you something different. They'll tell you about the lights, the chanting, the convoys of black vehicles that arrive without announcement and leave without trace. They'll tell you about the nights when the tower hums. Some say it's a monument of stone, a geological curiosity, nothing more. Others say it's the stump of something that once touched the sky. And a very small number of people with security clearances, offshore accounts and names you'd recognise from television, say it's still alive, still growing, still waiting. This is the story of what happens when someone watches back. Chapter 1. The Man Who Worked the Night Roads. Michael Carver had lived in northeastern Wyoming his entire life. 52 years of wide skies, brutal winters, and the kind of silence that makes city people uncomfortable. He'd been born in Gillette, raised in Moorcroft, and spent the last 28 years working for the National Park Service maintaining the infrastructure roads around Devil's Tower National Monument. Night shifts mostly. He preferred them. Fewer tourists, fewer questions. Just him, his truck, the radio crackling with weather reports, and the tower standing sentinel against the stars. Michael knew every curve of State Highway 110, every pothole on the access roads, every blind turn where deer like to cross. He could drive the perimeter with his eyes closed, and sometimes on the longest nights he practically did. He'd heard all the stories, the Lakota legend of the bear clawing at the stone, leaving vertical grooves as 7 sisters escaped to the sky. The Close Encounters pilgrims who still showed up with synthesizers, trying to recreate the 5-tone sequence from the Spielberg film. The flat earthers who insisted the tower was proof of a megatree forest that once covered the planet. Michael had never believed any of it. Not the mystical interpretations, not the alien theories, not the giant tree hypothesis. He was a practical man. He fixed roads. He cleared rockfall. He filed reports in triplicate and went home to a 1-bedroom house with a dog named Rusty and a television that got 4 channels on a good day. Devil's Tower was just a rock. An impressive rock. A beautiful rock. But still, just a rock. That certainty lasted until October 17th, the night everything changed. Chapter 2. The Unscheduled Closure. It started with an email. Michael was finishing his second cup of coffee when the notification buzzed on his phone. 7:45 p.m, 15 minutes before his shift began. The subject line read, Immediate, Road Closure Directive, DTM-0-9-13. He opened it. Effective 1800 hours, October 17th. All access roads to Devil's Tower National Monument are closed for emergency geological surveying. Duration, 12 hours. All non-essential personnel are to vacate the area. Park enforcement will verify compliance. No exceptions. It was signed by someone Michael didn't recognise. No name, just a title. Regional Infrastructure Coordinator, Emergency Operations. Michael frowned. He'd been doing this job for nearly 3 decades. He knew every survey team, every seasonal closure, every maintenance window scheduled months in advance. Geological surveying didn't happen overnight. It required permits, equipment manifests, environmental impact assessments. And it definitely didn't happen in October. Survey teams worked in spring and summer when the ground was stable and the weather predictable. Fall in Wyoming was unpredictable. Early snow, freezing rain, winds that could knock a vehicle off the road. Michael checked the park's internal scheduling system. No survey teams logged, no equipment rentals approved, no geological consultants contracted. He called his supervisor. Voicemail. He called the park ranger station. Voicemail. He called the regional office in Denver. The line rang 8 times before a woman answered, sounding harried. "This is Carver. Night maintenance at Devil's Tower. I got a closure notice for tonight, but there's nothing in the system. Can you—" "The closure is authorized," she interrupted. "Follow the directive." "Who authorized it?" "I don't have that information." "What survey team is—" "I don't have that information either. The directive is valid. Comply or file an incident report." She hung up. Michael sat in his truck, engine idling, staring at the email on his phone. Something was wrong. In 28 years, he'd never seen a closure order issued with 0 notice, 0 explanation, and 0 paper trail. The Park Service was a bureaucracy. Everything had a paper trail. Everything except this. He should have driven home. He should have cracked open a beer, watched television, let someone else worry about mysterious closure orders. But Michael Carver had spent his entire life in the shadow of Devil's Tower, and he'd never, not once, felt curious about what happened there after dark. Until now. He put the truck in gear and headed toward the outer perimeter. Chapter 3. The Ring of 12. Michael parked on a ridge 3 miles northwest of the tower. It was a maintenance access point, technically within the monument's boundaries, but far enough from the main roads that nobody ever bothered with it. He'd used it 100 times to check remote culverts and drainage systems. From here you could see the tower's western face silhouetted against the night sky like a broken pillar holding up the stars. He killed the engine and waited. 9:37 p.m. The monument grounds were completely dark. No visitor centre lights, no parking lot floods, no security perimeter illumination, just darkness. And then light, not sudden, not bright, just there. Michael grabbed his binoculars. 12 lights, evenly spaced, arranged in a perfect circle around the tower's base. Not headlights, too stationary, not flashlights, too steady, they looked like torches. No, not torches. The light was too white, too clean. LED floods, maybe, or halogen lamps on portable stands. But why 12? Why arranged in perfect geometric precision? Michael counted again. 12. Exactly 12. He checked his watch. 9:41 p.m. He scanned the access roads with his binoculars. No vehicles, no movement. Where had the lights come from? He swept back to the tower. The lights remained, perfectly still, perfectly spaced. And then he saw the first vehicle. Chapter 4. The arrival. It came from the south, headlights off, moving slowly along the main access road. A black SUV. Cadillac Escalade, maybe. Hard to tell in the darkness. It stopped near the base of the tower just outside the ring of lights. Doors opened. 4 figures emerged dressed in dark clothing. They moved with the precise coordination of security personnel scanning the perimeter, checking sight lines, establishing positions. Then the second vehicle arrived. Another black SUV, same make, same slow approach. Then a third, 4th, 5th. Michael counted 11 vehicles in total, all identical, all unmarked, all arriving within 20 minutes. No park permits had been filed. No special event licenses issued. No documentation whatsoever. The figures from the vehicles began unloading equipment. Not geological surveying tools, not scientific instruments, portable generators, audio equipment. What looked like ceremonial stands or altars. Michael's hands were shaking as he adjusted the binoculars. The passengers began emerging from the later vehicles, and that's when he started recognizing faces. The first was a woman he'd seen on television 100 times. a tech CEO whose company had recently absorbed 3 competitors and whose net worth exceeded the GDP of several small nations. She stepped out of the third SUV wearing a long dark coat, her face illuminated briefly by interior lights. The second was a senator. Michael couldn't remember which state, but he recognised the silver hair, the sharp features, the way cameras loved that face during election cycles. The third was an actor, Academy Award winner, known for playing heroes in action films and philanthropists in prestige dramas. The fourth was a media mogul whose news network shaped global narratives. The fifth was a tech entrepreneur whose social media platform had replaced town squares and public discourse. One by one they emerged. Billionaires, politicians, cultural icons, people whose names appeared in Forbes lists and Time magazine covers. People who supposedly had nothing in common except wealth and influence, and yet here they were, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, walking toward Devil's Tower like pilgrims approaching a shrine. Michael felt his pulse hammering in his throat. This wasn't a survey team. This was something else entirely. Chapter 5. The Path of Torches. The security. Personnel had been busy. From his vantage point, Michael could see a temporary pathway leading from the parking area toward the base of the tower. It was lined with torches, real flames this time, not electric lights, casting flickering orange light across the pale stone. The path wound through the boulder field, carefully navigating the uneven terrain, ending at a flat area directly beneath the tower's western face. The attendees began walking, slowly, silently. Michael counted 23 people in total. Some he recognised, most he didn't, but all of them moved with the same deliberate purpose, the same ritualistic precision. And then he noticed what they were wearing. Over their expensive coats and tailored suits, they donned ceremonial robes, dark fabric, floor-length, hooded. As they walked, the robes caught the torchlight, revealing embroidered symbols, inverted pentagrams, tree sigils, massive trunks with roots spreading like veins, runic shapes Michael didn't recognise, but which felt ancient, pre-Christian, older than language itself. One woman, a banking executive whose face Michael had seen in financial news segments, carried a portable altar. It was small, maybe 2 feet across, carved from dark wood and covered in more symbols. A man, possibly a diplomat based on his bearing, carried what looked like a ceremonial staff. It was wrapped in leather and topped with something that caught the firelight wrong, like polished obsidian or volcanic glass. They weren't tourists. They weren't scientists. They were worshippers, and Devil's Tower wasn't a monument. It was their temple. Michael's mind raced back to the stories he'd dismissed for decades, the giant tree theory. It had always seemed absurd. The idea that Devil's Tower wasn't a volcanic intrusion but a petrified stump from an ancient megaforest. That Earth had once been covered in trees so massive they made modern redwoods look like saplings. That some prehistoric cataclysm had felled them, all, leaving only scattered stumps like Devil's Tower, Shiprock in New Mexico, and similar formations worldwide. Pseudoscience, geology deniers, conspiracy nonsense. But watching these people approach the tower in ritual formation, watching them treat it like something sacred, something alive, what if they knew something the rest of the world didn't? What if Devil's Tower wasn't dead stone? What if it was dormant? Chapter 6. The Frequency of Silence. The chanting began at 10:17 p.m. Michael heard it before he saw the source, a low resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the ground beneath his truck, rattling the windows, settling into his chest like a second heartbeat. It wasn't singing, it wasn't speaking, it was something between the two, a vocalization that felt older than words, structured yet alien, harmonic yet mechanical. Through the binoculars, he watched the robed figures form a circle around the tower's base. They stood, perfectly still, heads slightly bowed, hands raised to chest height, palms facing inward. The chant continued. No visible conductor, no rhythm section, no leader keeping time, and yet they were perfectly synchronized. The sound had texture, layers. It felt less like music and more like machinery, like the resonance of a massive engine idling deep underground, its vibrations surfacing through stone and soil. Michael had worked around heavy equipment his entire career. He knew the feel of generators, the hum of transformers, the grinding of hydraulic systems. This was different. This felt intentional, designed. And then he noticed the silence. The crickets had stopped. The wind had died. Even the distant highway noise, usually a constant whisper on Wyoming nights, had vanished. It was as if the world was holding its breath. Michael scanned the area with his binoculars. The grassland surrounding the tower was normally alive with nocturnal activity, deer grazing, coyotes prowling, bats, hunting insects beneath the stars. Nothing moved, not a single animal, not a single bird. Even the insects, the ubiquitous moths and beetles that swarmed around any light source, were gone. The only living things in the entire landscape were the 23 people standing in a circle, chanting in a language Michael didn't recognise, worshipping a tower that shouldn't exist. And then the tower responded. Chapter 7. The Stone That Remembers. It started as a vibration. Michael felt it through the truck's frame, a low-frequency tremor that made the steering wheel buzz beneath his white-knuckled grip. At first, he thought it was an earthquake. Wyoming got them occasionally, minor tremors from the Yellowstone caldera or distant fault line adjustments. But this was different. This was rhythmic, pulsing in time with the chanting. Through the binoculars, he watched the tower itself, the hexagonal columns, those perfect vertical striations that geologists attributed to cooling. Basalt seemed to shimmer in the torchlight, not from heat distortion, not from atmospheric interference. They were pulsing, subtle, barely perceptible, but undeniable, as if the stone was breathing. Michael's rational mind scrambled for explanations. Resonance effects from the chanting, acoustic phenomena amplified by the tower's unique structure, infrasound frequencies causing visual distortions. But his instincts, the part of him that had survived 52 Wyoming winters by trusting his gut, knew better. The tower was reacting. He could feel heat now, even from 3 miles away. Not the ambient warmth of bodies and torches. Something deeper. Something radiating outward from the stone itself, warming the October air, creating convection currents that made the stars ripple overhead. Michael thought about basalt, about igneous rock, about the geological formation story he'd heard 1,000 times. 60 million years ago, magma pushed up through sedimentary layers but never reached the surface. It cooled slowly underground, forming crystalline columns. Over millennia, erosion removed the softer surrounding rock, leaving the harder basalt tower exposed. A perfectly reasonable explanation. Except, what if the tower wasn't basalt? What if it was wood? Petrified over epochs, compressed, mineralized, transformed from organic to mineral while retaining the fundamental structure, the vertical grain, the hexagonal cells, the internal channels that once carried water and nutrients from roots to canopy. What if Devil's Tower was exactly what it looked like? A stump, the severed base of a tree so massive it defied comprehension. And if that were true, if the tower was fossilized wood instead of cooled magma, then the next question became unavoidable. Could petrified wood still conduct energy? Could it still remember being alive? Michael watched the robed figures continue their chant, watched the tower pulse in response, and felt the answer settling into his bones like winter cold. Yes. Chapter 8. The Platform of Rings. At 10:41 p.m. the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the vibration ceased, leaving only the whisper of Michael's own breathing and the tick of cooling metal in the truck's engine. The robed figures remained motionless for exactly 60 seconds. Then they began to move. The security personnel brought forward a circular platform, maybe 20 feet in diameter, constructed from what looked like dark metal or composite material, It took 6 people to carry it, moving with the strained precision of pallbearers. They set it down at the tower's base, directly centred beneath the western face. Michael adjusted his binoculars, increasing magnification despite the growing shake in his hands. The platform's surface was covered in carved symbols, concentric circles like tree rings, but not random, not organic. These were perfect, mathematical, spiralling inward toward a central point with geometric precision that made Michael's eyes hurt to follow. Between the rings, more symbols, runes, glyphs, characters from alphabets Michael didn't recognise. Some looked vaguely Scandinavian, others resembled Sanskrit or ancient Sumerian. A few seemed completely alien, angles that shouldn't fit together, curves that defied Euclidean geometry. The platform wasn't just decorative, it was functional. A map, a key, a diagram of something vast and complex. The robed figures formed a circle around it, leaving the centre empty. Then the altar arrived. Chapter 9. The Obsidian Offering. 8 people carried it. A massive slab of polished obsidian, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, supported by an ornate metal frame. Even from 3 miles away, Michael could see how the volcanic glass caught the torchlight, reflecting it, refracting it, seeming to absorb and emit light simultaneously. They placed it at the platform's centre, directly over the convergence point of all the carved rings. The altar's surface wasn't smooth. It was covered in objects, fragments of fossilised wood, ranging from thumbnail-sized splinters to pieces as large as a human forearm. The wood had the distinctive texture of petrification, mineralised, heavy, transformed from carbon to silica over incomprehensible time. Bone relics, not modern, not recent. These were ancient, yellowed, partially fossilised, worked into shapes that might have been tools or ceremonial objects. Michael couldn't tell from this distance, but something about their arrangement felt deliberate, sacred, metallic artefacts, strange alloys that didn't match any metal Michael recognised. They had a greenish patina, like old copper, but the shapes were wrong. Too angular, too precise, too manufactured. One of the robed figures stepped forward. Michael recognised the bearing, if not the face. Someone used to authority, to command, to being obeyed without question. This person wore a different robe, while the others were plain dark fabric. This one was embroidered with gold thread forming an intricate tree pattern. The tree's trunk was straight and massive. Its roots spread across the robe's hem like underground rivers. Its branches reached toward the shoulders, each one ending in symbols that might have been stars or fruits or watchful eyes. But it was the mask that made Michael's breath catch. The figure wore a ceremonial mask carved from dark wood, depicting a horned entity that was neither fully human nor fully animal. The face was elongated, almost skull-like. The horns curved upward and backward like those of a ram or ancient forest deity. The eyes were hollow sockets, creating the unsettling impression that something behind the mask was looking out. This was the leader, the one who would speak for all of them, the one who would address whatever they believed lived beneath Devil's Tower. The masked figure raised both arms, the chanting resumed, but this time Michael could make out individual words, or what might have been words, fragmented through distortion and distance and his own pounding heartbeat. He pulled out his phone, started recording. The audio quality would be terrible, but maybe, if he survived this, if he didn't disappear like so many conspiracy theorists who got too close to uncomfortable truths, maybe someone could analyse it, translate it, confirm what he was hearing. The chant had structure now, call and response. The masked leader would vocalise a phrase and the circle would echo it back, their voices layered and harmonic. Michael caught fragments. He who was cut shall rise again. The root still drinks. Beneath the earth, blood and bone and breath, to the rooted one. The rooted one, not a god of the sky, not a deity of heaven or light or transcendent salvation, a god of roots, of depth, of things buried and patient and very, very old. Michael's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the binoculars steady. These people, billionaires and politicians and cultural elites, weren't just performing theatre. They weren't playing at mysticism or engaging in rich people eccentricity. They believed. They believed Devil's Tower wasn't a stump. They believed it was a severed limb of something planetary, something that predated human civilization, something that had been cut down in an ancient war or cataclysm or act of cosmic violence, and they believed its roots were still alive, still drinking, still waiting to grow again. Chapter 10. The Sky Turns Inward. At 11:03 p.m, the clouds began to move. Michael had been watching the sky peripherally, keeping most of his attention on the ritual below. But movement overhead pulled his gaze upward. The clouds were spiralling, not scudding along on wind currents, not dissipating or forming through normal meteorological processes, spiralling, rotating slowly around a central point directly above Devil's Tower like water circling, a drain. Michael had lived in Wyoming long enough to recognise every weather pattern, every atmospheric phenomenon. He'd seen mammatus clouds and lenticular formations and virga, and every variation of prairie storm system. This was none of those things. This was deliberate. The spiral tightened, clouds compressing toward the tower's summit, creating a vortex that seemed to pull down instead of up, as if the sky itself was being drawn toward the stone. And then the stars began to shift, subtle at first, just a slight displacement, like heat shimmer distorting distant lights, but it intensified. Constellations Michael had known since childhood, Orion, Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, seemed to bend around the vortex above the tower, their positions warping, their familiar patterns dissolving into geometric chaos. The chanting grew louder, more urgent. The masked leader's voice rose above the others, no longer calling and waiting for response, but driving forward in a continuous stream of syllables that might have been language or might have been something older than language. Pure intention vocalized into sound. And from the summit of Devil's Tower, something began to emerge. A light. Not bright, not blinding. Dim red, barely visible. Like the glow of distant coals or the bioluminescence of deep-sea creatures. But it wasn't shining upward from the stone. It was being pulled downward from the sky. Michael watched, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were reporting. The red light descended from the spiral of clouds like a thread being drawn through a needle's eye. It touched the tower's summit and seemed to sink into the stone, absorbed immediately, leaving only the faintest afterglow. Then it happened again. Another thread of red light drawn down from the sky, absorbed into the tower. Then another. The tower was drinking light, pulling it from the heavens, feeding on it. Michael thought about trees, about photosynthesis, about the way plants draw energy from sunlight, converting electromagnetic radiation into chemical fuel through processes so complex that scientists still didn't fully understand them. What if Devil's Tower was doing the same thing? What if the ritual had awakened some ancient mechanism, some petrified biological process that still functioned despite millions of years of mineralization? What if the tower could still eat? The thought sent ice through Michael's veins. If it could eat light, what else could it consume? Chapter 11. The Faces in Firelight. The ritual was intensifying. The robed figures had begun moving around the platform, not walking but swaying, their bodies undulating in time with the chanting, creating waves of motion that rippled around the circle like wind through grass. And in their fervour the robes began to open. Michael watched through the binoculars as expensive fabric fell away, revealing the people beneath. He recognised more faces now, a former president, not recent, not controversial. The kind of elder statesman who appeared at charity events and received lifetime achievement awards and was universally praised for their wisdom and service. Kneeling before an obsidian altar, chanting to something beneath the earth. A tech CEO whose company dominated global communications infrastructure. whose algorithms determined what billions of people saw, heard, believed, swaying in ritual ecstasy, eyes closed, completely surrendered. A media personality known for warmth and relatability, whose morning show attracted 20 million viewers, whose book club selections became instant bestsellers, whose endorsement could make or break careers, arms raised, chanting in a language she definitely hadn't learned at her Ivy League university. A banking executive whose decisions influenced global markets, whose firm had survived multiple financial crises, whose name appeared on the boards of dozens of major corporations, prostrate on the ground, forehead pressed to stone, worshipping. These weren't marginal figures, not fringe celebrities or has-been politicians clinging to relevance. These were the people who shaped the world, who determined policy, who controlled information flow, who decided what was true and what was dismissed as conspiracy. And they were all here, in the middle of nowhere, treating a Wyoming rock formation like a living god. Michael felt his understanding of reality fracturing. He'd spent his entire life operating under certain assumptions, that the world worked according to knowable laws, that powerful people were rational actors, that mysticism and superstition were relics of pre-scientific thinking. But watching a former head of state kneel before Devil's Tower, watching billionaires chant in dead languages, watching cultural icons treat petrified stone like a deity, either they were all insane, or they knew something the rest of humanity didn't. The chanting reached a crescendo. The masked leader stepped onto the platform approaching the obsidian altar, raising both arms toward the tower's summit. And Michael heard words he could actually understand. The covenant remains. The root remembers, blood for depth, bone for strength, breath for the one who waits. The circle responded in unison. He who was cut shall rise again. Then silence, absolute and terrible. Even the vibration stopped. The red light ceased descending from the sky. The clouds stilled in their spiral pattern. Everything waited. And Michael realized with horrifying clarity, the ritual was reaching its climax. The moment of offering had arrived. Chapter 12. The Container. 2 security personnel approached the platform carrying a sealed container. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox made from what looked like brushed steel or titanium. No visible seams, no obvious lid, just a perfectly smooth metal cube that reflected torchlight like a mirror. They set it before the masked leader and stepped back. The leader touched the container's surface. Michael couldn't see exactly what happened next. The angle was wrong, the distance too great, but the container opened. No hinges, no latches. It simply divided, separating along invisible seams to reveal something inside. The leader reached in and removed an object. Michael strained against the binocular's maximum magnification, trying to see what it was. Small, organic, irregular shape. A heart? No. Too small for human, too large for animal. A plant? A root? Maybe. The leader held it up, displaying it to the circle. The chanting resumed, softer now, reverent rather than urgent. Then the leader approached Devil's Tower itself. At the base of the western face, barely visible in the torchlight, there was a fissure. Michael had seen it 1,000 times during daylight hours. Just a crack in the stone, maybe 6 inches wide, running vertically for several feet. Geologists said it was a natural stress fracture from centuries of freeze-thaw cycles. But now, watching the masked leader approach it with ceremonial purpose, Michael wondered if it was something else. An opening, an entrance, a mouth. The leader placed the object into the fissure, and the tower swallowed it. Michael saw the stone pulse, actually pulse, like a throat contracting, and the object disappeared into the crack, drawn inward as if by suction or peristalsis, or some mechanism that stone shouldn't possess. The ground trembled, not violently, not destructively, but unmistakably. A single deep shudder that rippled outward from the tower's base, travelling through soil and bedrock, reaching Michael's truck 3 miles away and making the entire vehicle shake. His coffee thermos toppled over, the binoculars bounced against his chest, and the chanting exploded into something primal and ecstatic and absolutely terrifying. Chapter 13. The Pulse of Awakening. The tower began to sing. That's the only word Michael could use later when he tried to describe it to himself when he lay. Awake at 3 a.m, wondering if he'd imagined the whole thing, or if reality really was that strange. The tower sang. A deep resonant tone, felt more than heard, vibrating through earth and air and bone with such intensity that Michael's vision blurred. It wasn't mechanical, it wasn't geological, it wasn't any sound a rock should make, it was organic, alive. The frequency was so low it bypassed his ears entirely, resonating directly in his chest, his skull, his stomach, making his organs vibrate in sympathetic harmony. And the world responded. The trees surrounding the monument, ponderosa pines and junipers that had stood for decades, began to bend. Not from wind, there was no wind. They bent inward, toward the tower, as if drawn by invisible force, as if gravity itself had shifted, making Devil's Tower the new centre of attraction, the point around which everything else must orbit. Branches reached toward the stone. Roots beneath the soil, Michael couldn't see them but could feel. Them, twisted and strained, growing toward the tower with accelerated desperation. The robed figures had stopped chanting. They stood motionless, arms raised, heads thrown back, bodies rigid with what might have been ecstasy or terror or both. And Michael felt it too. A pulling sensation, a magnetic draw, an overwhelming urge to leave the truck, walk down from the ridge, cross the 3 miles of grassland, and join the circle around the tower, to kneel, to worship, to surrender. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white, fought the urge with every shred of rational thought remaining. No, 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 this is wrong, this is dangerous, get out, get out. But part of him, a deep, primal, evolutionarily ancient part, wanted to stay, wanted to approach, wanted to touch the stone and feel that vibration directly, without distance or mediation, wanted to feed the tower, give it what it needed, blood, bone, breath. Michael bit the inside of his cheek hard enough to taste copper. The pain anchored him, reminded him he was separate, individual, not part of the collective consciousness that seemed to be forming around Devil's Tower, turning 23 separate minds into a single organism, pulsing in synchrony with ancient stone. He fumbled for the ignition, couldn't find it, hands shaking too badly. The tower's song intensified. The trees bent further, some of them cracking, wood splintering under impossible stress. And Michael saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The grass was growing, in real time, accelerated, blades shooting upward, seeds germinating instantly, roots spreading like networks of veins, all reaching toward the tower, all feeding it nutrients and moisture and life. The tower wasn't just stone, it was a node, a connection point in some vast underground network. And the ritual had activated it, woken something that had been sleeping for centuries, maybe millennia, maybe longer. Michael finally got the key turned. The engine roared to life, and that's when the drones appeared. Chapter 14. They know you're watching 3 of them. Military-grade quadcopters, moving fast and silent except for the distinctive whine of high RPM rotors. They came from the south, sweeping the perimeter in coordinated search patterns, equipped with spotlight arrays and what looked like thermal imaging cameras. Michael killed the headlights immediately. Too late. One of the drones adjusted course, angling toward his position. His mind raced. 3 miles from the tower, outside the official monument boundaries, technically on public land. But that wouldn't matter if they decided it mattered. He'd seen their faces, recorded their ritual, witnessed something nobody was supposed to see. The drone closed to within 100 yards, its spotlight sweeping the ridge. Michael ducked below the dashboard, phone clutched to his chest, every instinct screaming at him to drive, to run, to do anything except sit still like prey, waiting for the predator. The spotlight passed over the truck, once, twice, then moved on. Michael waited, barely breathing, counting seconds. 60, 90, 120. Slowly he raised his head. The drones were circling the entire perimeter now, expanding their search pattern, scanning every approach road, every ridge, every possible vantage point. They weren't guarding the ritual participants. They were guarding the ritual itself, protecting it from observation, from documentation, from exposure. Michael watched ground vehicles deploy from the monument parking area, SUVs fanning out, teams of security personnel spreading across the landscape with military precision. They were sweeping, looking for witnesses, looking for cameras, looking for anyone stupid enough to watch the things powerful people do in darkness. He had maybe 10 minutes before they reached his position. Michael started the truck, keeping the headlights off, using the ambient starlight to navigate. He knew these roads, knew every switchback and cattle guard and unmarked turnoff. He could lose them in the maze of service roads and ranch access paths that crisscrossed northeastern Wyoming like veins. But he had to move now, had to get the footage somewhere safe, somewhere backed up, somewhere that would survive even if he didn't. He pulled out his phone, started uploading the video to a cloud storage account even as he drove. The progress bar crawled. 5%. The drones were getting closer, their search pattern tightening. 12%. He could see vehicle headlights now maybe 2 miles south. 21%. His hands were shaking again. 34%. Come on, come on, come on. 59%. The nearest drone banked hard, coming back toward his position. 78%. Upload complete. Michael deleted the local copy, cleared his phone's cache, and threw it under the seat. If they found him now, they'd find nothing. Just a maintenance worker who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. No evidence, no proof, nothing but his word against theirs. And who would believe him? Who would believe that America's elite gathered in Wyoming to worship a petrified tree stump? Who would believe Devil's Tower was alive? Michael drove into the darkness, killing even his parking lights, navigating by memory and desperation. Behind him, the tower pulsed one final time, and then went dark. Chapter 15. The morning after. Michael didn't go home. He drove east, putting miles between himself and the monument, finally pulling into a truck stop near Sundance at 2:30 a.m. He sat in the parking lot, engine running, heat on full blast, trying to stop shaking. His phone was still under the seat. He left it there. Instead, he went inside, bought coffee and a burner phone from the convenience store, and sat in a booth by the window where he could watch the parking lot. Nobody followed him. No black SUVs, no security personnel, just long haul, truckers and third shift workers and one exhausted waitress who refilled his coffee without comment. At 6 a.m, Michael drove back toward Devil's Tower. Not close, not anywhere near the monument itself, but close enough to see it from the highway. The sun was rising, painting the stone gold and orange and red. From this distance in daylight it looked perfectly normal. Just a geological formation, a tourist attraction, a national monument. There were no vehicles in the parking area, no security perimeter, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. Michael pulled over at a scenic overlook, got out of the truck, walked to the information placard that explained the tower's formation. Devil's Tower formed approximately 60 million years ago when magma intruded into sedimentary rocks, but cooled before reaching the surface. Erosion of the softer surrounding material exposed the resistant igneous core, creating the distinctive columnar structure we see today. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly scientific, perfectly wrong. Michael stood there for a long time, staring at the tower, remembering the way it had pulsed, the way it had sung, the way it had drawn light from the sky and made the earth tremble. A tour bus pulled into the overlook. Tourists piled out, cameras ready, excited to see the famous landmark from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. They took photos, pointed, laughed, completely oblivious. Michael got back in his truck and drove away. Chapter 16. The Digital Trail. Michael spent the next 3 weeks doing research. Not at home, too risky. He used library computers, coffee shop Wi-Fi, always on VPN, always in incognito mode, never spending more than an hour in any single location. He started with the faces he'd recognised. The former president, the tech CEO, the media personality, the banking executive. On the surface, they had nothing in common. Different political affiliations, different industries, different public personas, but when Michael started digging deeper, patterns emerged, board memberships. The tech CEO sat on the board of a policy think tank. The banking executive was also on that board. So was the media personality, and the former president was a senior advisor. The think tank's stated purpose: fostering global cooperation on environmental and economic challenges. Innocuous enough, but Michael cross-referenced their funding sources: shell companies, offshore trusts, anonymous donors, all the money flowing through the same law firm, a firm that specialised in privacy protection for high net worth individuals, a firm with offices in Wyoming. He dug further. Conference attendance. Every person he'd seen at Devil's Tower had attended the same exclusive gathering 3 months prior. Not Davos, not Bilderberg. Something smaller, more secretive. The Aspen Environmental Summit. No media coverage, no press releases, just a brief mention in a local newspaper about road closures and temporary flight restrictions. Michael found satellite imagery of the Aspen area during those dates. Data blackout, no commercial satellite coverage, no Google Earth updates, just grey blank spaces where imagery should have been. The same kind of blackout he'd noticed for Devil's Tower on the night of the ritual. Someone was controlling what could be seen from above. He started looking at geological survey data. Devil's Tower appeared in dozens of studies, core samples, mineral analysis, seismic monitoring. But access to the raw data was restricted. National security concerns, apparently. Why would a 60-million-year-old rock formation pose national security concerns? Unless it wasn't just a rock. Michael found academic papers about petrified forests, about the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, about similar formations worldwide, all dismissed as pseudoscience. The theory that these weren't scattered fragments, but remnants of a global megaforest. But one paper, published in an obscure geology journal in 1973, took the theory seriously. The author analysed mineral composition of Devil's Tower and similar formations, found anomalies, crystalline structures inconsistent with basalt cooling, cellular patterns suggesting organic origin, chemical signatures indicating biological processes. The paper concluded further investigation warranted into alternative formation hypotheses. The author disappeared 6 months after publication. Not dramatically, not suspiciously, just stopped publishing, stopped teaching, vanished from academic circles. Michael found an obituary from 1978. Died of natural causes, age 41. Chapter 17. The Root Network Theory. The more Michael researched, the more the theory crystallized. Earth had once been different. Fundamentally, radically different. Not millions of years ago, not during the age of dinosaurs, more recently, within human memory. Not recorded human history, the 5,000 years of civilizations and empires and written records. But human memory, the deep ancestral memory encoded in myth and legend and creation stories. Every ancient culture had the same basic narrative. A golden age, a paradise, a time when the world was different, when trees grew to impossible heights, when the sky was closer, when giants walked the earth, then catastrophe, flood, fire, divine punishment, the world remade, the paradise lost. What if those weren't metaphors? What if Earth had been covered in megatrees, organisms so massive they created their own ecosystems, their own atmospheric effects, their own gravitational influences, trees whose trunks were miles wide? whose canopies touched the edge of space, whose roots penetrated to the mantle, connected underground in vast networks, sharing nutrients and information and consciousness. Not individual organisms, but a single planetary entity, a world forest. And what if something had cut them down? War, cataclysm, deliberate, extermination, leaving only stumps, Devil's Tower in Wyoming, Shiprock in New Mexico, the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, the Organ Pipes in Namibia, dozens of formations worldwide, all showing the same hexagonal columnar structure, all dismissed as volcanic activity despite the suspicious similarities. What if they were stumps? What if the roots were still alive, still connected, still waiting? Michael found forums, message boards, communities of people who believed this theory. Most were dismissed as cranks, conspiracy theorists, flat earthers, but some posted evidence, photographs of hexagonal patterns in stone that matched wood grain too perfectly, chemical analyses showing organic compounds in supposedly inorganic formations, reports of vibrations detected near these sites during specific astronomical alignments. One poster claimed to have worked for a geological survey company contracted by the government, said they'd been ordered to falsify data, to report volcanic origin even when samples suggested otherwise, said there were military installations hidden near every major petrified stump formation, said those installations monitored seismic activity that didn't match any known geological process, said the activity was getting stronger. The post was deleted within hours, the user account banned. But Michael had screenshot it, backed it up to multiple cloud services, saved it to encrypted drives. He was learning to think like someone being hunted, because he probably was. Chapter 18. Return to the tower. 3 months after the ritual, Michael went back. Not officially, not during visiting hours. He took vacation time from work, told nobody where he was going, and drove to Devil's Tower on a Tuesday night in January. Freezing, moonless, empty. He parked at the same ridge 3 miles out, same vantage point, sat in the truck with the engine off, heat slowly dissipating, breath fogging the windows. No ritual tonight, no robed figures, no chanting, just the tower silhouetted against stars, silent and still. Michael checked his watch. 11 p.m. He waited. 11:30. Nothing. Midnight. Still nothing. At 12:17 a.m. he got out of the truck. The cold hit him like a physical force. 20 degrees below zero. Wind chill making it feel even worse. He walked toward the tower. Not all the way. Not to the base. Just close enough. Close enough to touch the soil. He knelt in the frozen grass, pulled off one glove, and pressed his bare hand to the ground. Waited. Listened. Felt. For a long time, there was nothing. Just cold earth. Frozen solid. Dead until spring. Then, a vibration. Faint. Barely perceptible. Like the idle of a distant engine or the whisper of underground water. Michael closed his eyes. Concentrated. The vibration intensified. Not random, not geological. Rhythmic. Pulsing. Like a heartbeat. Slow. Patient. Ancient. He opened his eyes and looked at Devil's Tower. In the starlight it looked the same as always. Just stone. But he could feel it now. Feel the life beneath. The roots spreading through miles of bedrock, connecting to other roots, other stumps, other remnants of whatever had once covered Earth. A network, planetary in scale, still alive, still aware, still waiting. Michael heard something then, not with his ears, in his mind. A whisper, not words, not language, just recognition. The tower knew he was there, knew he had witnessed, knew he understood, and it was content to wait. Because time meant nothing to something that had existed for epochs. A few more years, a few more decades, a few more centuries. Eventually the world would change, the ice would melt, the soil would warm, the conditions would align, and the roots would grow again, fed by ritual, by worship, by the carefully cultivated devotion of those who knew the truth and kept it secret, the powerful, the elite, the guardians of hidden knowledge. They would tend the stumps like gardeners tending saplings, nurturing them, feeding them, waiting for the day when the world trees would rise again. Michael stood up, his hand numb from cold and contact, looked at Devil's Tower one last time. It stood silent, patient, eternal. And deep beneath his feet, in the frozen darkness of ancient root networks, something pulsed. Slow, steady, alive. Epilogue. The patient growth. Michael Carver still works night shifts maintaining roads around Devil's Tower National Monument. He files his reports in triplicate, clears rockfall, checks drainage systems, lives a quiet life in a one-bedroom house with a dog named Rusty and a television that gets 4 channels on a good day. He never talks about what he saw, never posts about it online, never tries to convince anyone of the truth. He learned early that truth doesn't spread through argument or evidence. It spreads through patience, through waiting, through the slow accumulation of people who witness things they cannot explain and choose to remember rather than forget. He's not alone. There are others. Park rangers who've heard the chanting, maintenance workers who've felt the vibrations, tourists who visited at the wrong time and seen things that shouldn't exist. They recognise each other. Small signs, subtle acknowledgements, a certain way of looking at the tower, a hesitation before entering the monument grounds after dark, a refusal to accept the official geological explanation. The network grows, slowly, carefully, just like the roots beneath their feet. Michael doesn't know what will happen when the trees finally grow again. Maybe it will be apocalyptic, the end of human civilization, crushed beneath organisms too vast to comprehend. Maybe it will be transcendent, a return to paradise, to the golden age remembered in myth. Maybe it will be something else entirely, but he knows it's coming. He can feel it in the ground. In the increasing frequency of rituals, more gatherings, more chanting, more offerings fed into stone fissures around the world, in the way weather patterns are shifting, growing stranger, as if the atmosphere itself is remembering how things used to be, in the dreams people are having, shared dreams of massive trees, of climbing through canopies that touch the stars, of roots spreading through darkness, connecting everything, making all life part of a single vast organism. The world is changing, has been changing, will continue to change, and Devil's Tower stands patient, waiting, because if it truly is a stump, then something once stood there so large it touched the heavens, and if roots remain beneath us, if networks still connect the scattered stumps across continents, if the organisms are merely dormant rather than dead, then whatever was cut down might not be gone forever, just sleeping, just waiting, just growing, slow and patient and inevitable, the way trees always do. What if the deadliest attack on a United States naval vessel since World War II wasn't an accident at all? What if 34 Americans died not in confusion, but as collateral damage in a weapons test so secret that the US government spent 50 years burying the truth beneath layers of classified silence? Before we dive into this story, I want to give a massive thank you to Mr. Hill420 and so many others who suggested this topic. Your curiosity drives these investigations, and I'm grateful for it. If you have ideas for future videos, drop them in the comments below. Now let's explore what really happened on June 8th, 1967 in the Eastern Mediterranean, and why the echoes of that day still reverberate through classified channels today. Act 1. The Silence Before the Storm. June 8th, 1967, 1400 local time. Eastern Mediterranean, 25 nautical miles off the Sinai coast. The USS Liberty cut through calm waters under a flawless Mediterranean sky. At 455 feet long and displacing over 10,000 tons, the modified Victory-class cargo ship looked unremarkable, a rusting relic of World War II pressed back into service. But appearances deceived. Bristling with antennas, microwave dishes, and SIGINT collection arrays, Liberty was the NSA's floating ear in the Middle East, listening to a region on the brink of tearing itself apart. The Six-Day War had erupted 4 days earlier. Regional powers clashed across ancient battlefields, while Cold War superpowers watched nervously from the sidelines. The Soviet Mediterranean squadron lurked just over the horizon. American forces maintained a tense neutrality, and through it all, Liberty listened. Below decks, in the cramped research spaces that reeked of coffee, cigarette smoke and hot electronics, 45 cryptologic technicians from the Naval Security Group worked in shifts. They monitored everything: military communications, diplomatic channels, encrypted transmissions from ships and aircraft across the region. Every signal, every transmission, every whispered order flowed through their receivers and into the classified intelligence pipeline feeding Fort Meade, Maryland. Petty Officer First Class Mark Reynolds had been on station for 6 hours straight. At 24 years old, he possessed the kind of focused intensity that made him perfect for signals intelligence work, able to distinguish signal from noise in the chaotic electromagnetic spectrum of a war zone. His station monitored multiple frequencies, including those reserved for American military operations. At 14:13, Reynolds's headphones crackled with a transmission that made him straighten in his chair. The signal came through on a frequency that shouldn't have been active, a restricted channel reserved for classified naval operations. The encryption pattern was sophisticated, military grade, but something felt wrong. Reynolds keyed his recorder and leaned closer. "Shadow 7 to Cyan Control," a voice said in clear English with an American accent. "Phase 2 parameters confirmed. Frequency modulation holding at 7.83 Hz. Standing by for sequence initiation." Reynolds felt his pulse quicken. Cyan Control? That designation didn't appear in any briefing material, and that frequency, 7.83 Hz, meant nothing to him in military terms. He scribbled notes frantically. A second voice responded, also American, clipped and efficient. "Cyan Control confirms. Maintain visual contact with target vessel until phase termination. Weather conditions optimal. Execute on my mark." Target vessel? Reynolds' hand moved to the intercom switch to alert the communications officer, but he hesitated. Intercepting US military communications wasn't unusual. The NSA gathered signals from American forces routinely for training and verification purposes. But this felt different. That frequency. The deliberate emphasis on visual contact. The designation Cyan. He never got the chance to report it. At 14:14, the radar operator 2 compartments forward shouted into the circuit. "Multiple surface contacts bearing 090, range 30 miles and closing. Fast movers. Confirmed aircraft." On the bridge, Commander William McGonigal lowered his binoculars and squinted into the eastern sky. He'd been tracking distant aircraft for the past 20 minutes, reconnaissance flights he'd assumed. The Liberty flew an American flag the size of a garage door. Her hull number was clearly visible. In these conditions, with visibility exceeding 10 miles and zero wind, there was no possibility of confusion. At 14:15, 3 unidentified jet fighters dropped from high altitude and screamed toward the Liberty at 500 knots. The first indication of hostile intent came not from weapons but from proximity. The aircraft circled the ship 3 times, low enough that sailors on deck could see them clearly. Some waved, assuming they were friendly forces. A few took photographs. Then the fighters banked hard and lined up for attack runs. What happened next would be disputed for decades, analysed frame by frame, dissected in naval courts and congressional hearings. But for the men aboard Liberty, the truth was simple and absolute. They were being attacked by unidentified forces. The first cannon rounds shredded the forward antennas at 14:16. Radar dishes exploded in sparks. Communications arrays tumbled into the sea. The aircraft made multiple passes, their weapons stitching lines of destruction across the deck and superstructure. Commander McGonagall stood on the bridge wing, fully exposed, shouting orders as shrapnel tore through steel around him. He wouldn't leave his post, wouldn't abandon the con even as the windows exploded inward and instrument panels sparked and died. Below decks, Reynolds clutched his headphones as the compartment shook. The overhead lights flickered. Then, through the static and interference, he heard it again, that American voice, calm and analytical. Sine wave sequence maintaining coherence. Phase 2 progressing nominally. His recorder was still running. At 14:24, the fighters broke off. For 8 minutes, an eerie quiet descended. Damage control teams scrambled topside. The wounded screamed for corpsmen. Fires burned in 3 compartments. Then sonar picked up high-speed screws. 3 unidentified torpedo boats emerged from the coastal haze, their decks crowded with sailors manning deck guns. They opened fire immediately, 40mm and 20mm rounds hammering the Liberty's hull, shredding life rafts, killing sailors who'd made it to the deck. At 14:31, one of the boats fired a torpedo. The torpedo struck the Liberty on the starboard side, below the waterline, directly beneath the signal's intelligence spaces. The explosion ripped through the research compartments like a fist through tissue paper. Bulkheads buckled. Seawater rushed in. 25 men died instantly, crushed or drowned in the flooding. Mark Reynolds survived only because he'd been thrown against a bulkhead by the blast. Unconscious, bleeding, half submerged in rising water, he clutched his recorder as shipmates dragged him through the darkness toward the ladders. The attack continued for another 40 minutes. By the time the attacking forces withdrew at 15:30, Liberty was a floating wreck. 34 men were dead. 171 were wounded. The ship listed heavily to starboard, fires still burning, taking on water. But she didn't sink, and below decks, in the flooded research spaces, a magnetic tape labelled Sine Wave Intercept 6867 floated in the darkness, sealed inside Reynolds' waterproof recorder bag. Act 2. The Inquiry. September the 1967. Naval Court of Inquiry. Malta. The official inquiry convened 3 months after the attack, far from American shores and prying media. Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd Jr. presided, a stern-faced officer with 30 years of service and a reputation for thorough investigation. The court's mandate was clear: determine what happened, who was responsible, and whether Liberty's crew bore any fault for their own casualties. From the beginning, something felt wrong. Witnesses testified to crystal clear weather, a clearly marked American flag, the ship's hull number visible for miles. They described the methodical nature of the assault, not frenzied combat, but deliberate targeting of antennas and communications equipment. Some testified to seeing torpedo boats machine gunning life rafts. The official explanation came swiftly: a case of mistaken identity during a chaotic regional conflict. Foreign forces had confused Liberty for an enemy vessel. Tragic but understandable in the fog of war, sincere apologies, compensation offered. The American government accepted this explanation within hours of the attack, but the evidence suggested otherwise. On the 3rd day of testimony, Mark Reynolds took the stand. His face was still mottled with burn scars, his left hand bandaged. He walked with a pronounced limp. The court recorder noted that he seemed nervous, kept glancing at the door. Admiral Kidd asked him to describe his duties on June 8th. Reynolds began with routine details, his station, his assignment, the frequencies he monitored. Then he paused. "Sir, I need to submit evidence," Reynolds said quietly. "What sort of evidence, Petty Officer?" "An audio recording. I made it during the attack. It contains transmissions I intercepted on a secure frequency. American voices coordinating the attack sequence." The courtroom went silent. Kidd leaned forward. "You recorded American personnel coordinating an attack on an American vessel." "I don't know what I recorded, sir. But the voices were American. They used a designation I'd never heard before, Cyan Wave. They spoke about phase sequences, frequency modulation, maintaining visual contact with the target vessel." Reynolds produced a reel-to-reel tape from a canvas bag, labelled in his own handwriting. "Cyan Wave Intercept 6867. A Navy lawyer immediately objected. The tape hadn't been submitted through proper evidence channels. Its chain of custody was questionable. Reynolds himself admitted he'd kept it hidden for 3 months, afraid of what might happen if he turned it over. Admiral Kidd examined the tape without playing it. "This will be entered into evidence and reviewed by appropriate authorities. Petty Officer Reynolds, you are to discuss this with no one outside this court. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." The tape was logged as Evidence Item 47B, placed in a sealed envelope and transferred to a secure evidence locker. It vanished. No official record of the tape exists in the declassified inquiry documents. Reynolds' testimony about it was redacted from the public version of the proceedings. When he tried to follow up weeks later, he was told the tape had been misplaced during transfer to NSA custody for technical analysis. 3 months later, Reynolds received orders to a submarine tender in the Pacific. His security clearance was administratively reduced. His service record noted, "Not recommended for cryptologic assignments." He never spoke publicly about Liberty or Cyan Wave again. Fort Meade, Maryland, November 1967. NASA headquarters. Linda Baker had worked for the National Security Agency for 11 years, analysing signals intelligence from every corner of the globe. At 36, she was one of the senior analysts in the Naval SIGINT Division, trusted with the most sensitive intercepts. In November 1967, she was tasked with reviewing backup recordings from the Liberty attack, part of the NSA's internal assessment of what went wrong with their intelligence collection that day. The work was tedious. Hours of radio chatter, static, routine military communications. But Baker had a gift for pattern recognition, for seeing anomalies others missed. On her 4th day reviewing the backups, she noticed something odd. At several points during the attack, 1414, 1422, 1429 and 1441, her spectrum analysis showed unusual electromagnetic activity. Brief bursts of extremely low-frequency interference, lasting only seconds but powerful enough to partially distort other signals. She ran the frequencies through analysis software, 7.83 Hz, repeating. Baker frowned. That frequency was known as the Schumann resonance, the natural electromagnetic frequency of the Earth's ionosphere, created by lightning discharges globally. It had nothing to do with military communications. Radio equipment didn't operate at that frequency. It was too low, too weak, essentially background noise of the planet itself. So why did it appear in military signal intercepts at the exact moments of Liberty's attack phases? She wrote a technical memo and submitted it through channels. The response came back 3 days later. Technical artifact. Atmospheric interference. No intelligence value. But Baker wasn't satisfied. She cross-referenced the timing against the attack timeline reconstructed from survivor testimony. The frequency spikes occurred precisely when aircraft began their runs, when the torpedo boats opened fire, when the torpedo was launched. Not random atmospheric interference, coordinated. She tried to dig deeper, requesting access to Liberty's raw intercept logs, the unprocessed recordings captured by the ship's equipment. Her request was denied. Those materials were classified at a level above your current access. Linda Baker had top-secret clearance. What could be above that? She tried a different approach. Using her access to the NSA's internal file system, she searched for any mention of Cyan Wave. One result appeared, a project file from 1965 heavily redacted, sponsored jointly by DARPA and the Office of Naval Intelligence. The project number was CW-12/7. The file contained only 3 pages. Most of it was blacked out, but one paragraph remained visible. Project Scion Wave explores applications of extremely low-frequency electromagnetic modulation for tactical radar signature manipulation. Testing requires controlled combat environment with multiple sensor platforms. Operational security classification, Cosmic Top Secret. Cosmic Top Secret was a NATO designation, higher than anything in the standard US classification system. Baker printed the page, then immediately regretted it. She looked around her cubicle, suddenly paranoid. This wasn't just classified. This was the kind of material people's careers ended over. She folded the page into her purse and deleted her search history. That night she typed a summary of her findings and mailed it to herself at her home address. If something happened to her at work, if these files disappeared, or she was suddenly reassigned, at least she'd have proof she'd seen them. 2 weeks later, her supervisor called her into a meeting. NSA Security was conducting a routine review of database access logs. Nothing to worry about, just standard procedure. They asked her about her search for Scion Wave. Baker kept her face neutral. I came across the term in a Liberty Intercept backup and wanted to understand the context. And did you? No, the file was mostly redacted. The security officer smiled. Good. That means the classification system is working. In the future, if you encounter project names you don't recognize, please submit an information request through proper channels rather than searching directly. Understood. Understood. She wasn't reassigned. Her clearance wasn't revoked, but the message was clear: some doors stay closed. Linda Baker returned to her routine work, analysing intercepts from Vietnam and the Soviet Union. She never searched for Scion Wave again, but she kept that printed page hidden in a safety deposit box. Act 3. The Declassified Ghost. 2003 to 2017. The Long Thaw. In the years following the Cold War's end, the intelligence community slowly began declassifying historical materials under the Freedom of Information Act. Thousands of pages from the 1960s and 70s filtered into public archives, NSA operational summaries, CIA memoranda, military intelligence assessments. The USS Liberty attack, still controversial decades later, attracted particular attention from researchers and conspiracy theorists. Survivors had formed advocacy groups. Journalists had written books questioning the official mistaken identity narrative. The government maintained its story quietly but firmly. In 2003, the NSA released the first batch of Liberty-related intercepts, heavily redacted but enough to confirm that the agency had been monitoring communications in real time during the attack. Linda Baker, now retired and 72 years old, read about the release in the Washington Post. She'd thought about that day in 1967 occasionally over the decades, wondered what had really happened to that tape, whether anyone else had noticed those strange frequency spikes. She requested her old security clearance be reactivated, a privilege available to retired intelligence personnel for consulting work. The approval took 6 months, but eventually she received her credentials and access to the NSA's historical archives in College Park, Maryland. She spent 3 weeks reading through the declassified Liberty materials. Most of it she'd seen before: the attack timeline, intercept summaries, damage reports. But then she noticed something. In the official NSA summary from June 1967, the page numbers jumped. Page 13 was followed by page 15. Page 14 was missing. Baker checked the original classification log. Page 14 had been titled Classified Naval Operations, Coordination with Advanced Research Projects. That page remained classified. She submitted a FOIA request for page 14 specifically. The response took 2 years. Denied. Material still classified in the interest of national security. But Baker had spent 11 years at NSA. She knew how to read around redactions, how to find information in metadata and file structures. She started pulling every document from 1967 that referenced classified naval operations in the Mediterranean. Most were routine: submarine deployments, carrier group movements, Soviet naval tracking operations, Then she found it. A budget document from early 1967, listing project expenditures for the Office of Naval Research. Buried in a table of appropriations, CW 12/7, Field Test Coordination, $8.7 million. The date range, May 15th, 1967 to June 30th, 1967, exactly covering the period of the Six-Day War. Baker's hands trembled as she photographed the page with her phone. After 50 years, proof that sine wave wasn't a phantom, wasn't something she'd imagined. She kept digging. Over the next 2 years she found fragments, a 1968 memo from DARPA referencing successful field demonstration of phase cancellation radar spoofing technology in operational environment, a 1970 patent application, US Patent 5,159,703, for electromagnetic signature modulation device, listing 3 inventors from Raytheon Advanced Systems and the Naval Research Laboratory, a 1982 intelligence report on Soviet radar capabilities noting, Soviet naval defense systems exhibit vulnerability to low-frequency phase modulation, similar to effects observed during classified operations in 1967. The pattern was unmistakable. Sine wave had been real, it had been tested, and Liberty had been there when it happened. But why attack the ship? If Liberty was collecting data for the NSA, if this was an American military operation, why would they attack their own intelligence vessel? Unless Liberty wasn't supposed to be there, unless the ship's presence was unauthorized, and its advanced listening equipment threatened to record something that was never meant to be recorded. Unless Liberty itself was the target, not by foreign forces, but by elements within the US military, conducting a weapons test that required complete secrecy. 2017. The breakthrough. In March 2017, the NSA released another batch of Liberty documents, the most extensive yet, over 3,000 pages. Researchers around the world began combing through them. Linda Baker, now 86 and fighting lung cancer, received a call from James Wilson, a historian at the Naval War College who'd been studying Liberty for 2 decades. "Linda, I found something," Wilson said, "in the intercept logs. There's a reference to your name." "What kind of reference?" "A memo from December 1967. Subject: Analyst concerns regarding low-frequency interference in Liberty intercepts. It says you submitted a technical report about unusual electromagnetic readings during the attack. Did you?" "Yes. They told me it was atmospheric interference. The memo says your analysis was forwarded to something called the Advanced Concepts Group for evaluation. That group reported directly to the NSA director. Whatever you found, Linda, it went to the very top." Baker felt a chill. "What else does it say?" "That your findings were consistent with expected technical signatures of active countermeasure systems." "Linda, they knew. They knew what you'd found, and they buried it." "Can you send me that memo?" "Already did. Check your email." Baker opened her laptop with shaking hands. The memo appeared on screen, typed on NSA letterhead, signed by an assistant director whose name had been redacted. One sentence leaped out at her. Analyst Baker's detection of 7.83 Hz modulation during combat operations confirmed successful field implementation of Project CW 12/7 parameters. Successful field implementation? They tested their radar spoofing technology using Liberty as an unwitting target, used it to make the ship appear and disappear on radar screens, creating confusion, creating plausible deniability for an attack that would destroy the evidence of the test itself. 34 Americans had died to protect a secret weapons program. But who had conducted the actual attack? Foreign forces used as unwitting proxies, unmarked US aircraft and vessels, mercenaries hired through intelligence cutouts. The memo didn't say. Perhaps that was the final layer of the secret, ensuring that even if the truth about sine wave emerged, no one could definitively prove who had pulled the triggers. Baker stared at the screen for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called someone she thought she'd never contact again. Act 4. The recording. 2025, 8 years later. Washington, D.C. Evan Carter was 34 years old and tired of writing about budget hearings and committee appointments for the Washington political blog that employed him. He'd gone into journalism to expose corruption, to hold power accountable. Instead, he spent his days rewriting press releases and attending briefings where nobody said anything real. Then a package arrived at his office with no return address, postmarked from Newport News, Virginia, home to the largest naval shipyard on the East Coast. Inside was a reel-to-reel tape in a waterproof bag, labelled in faded ink, Sine Wave Intercept 6867. Also inside, a typed note on yellowed paper. "Mr. Carter, you don't know me, but I know your work. This recording was made aboard USS Liberty during the attack on June 8th, 1967. I was told to destroy it. I couldn't. Before I die, someone should hear what really happened that day. Listen carefully. Look for Sine Wave. They're still using it. MR." Carter's first instinct was to throw it away. Anonymous packages, conspiracy theories about 50-year-old incidents. This was exactly the kind of rabbit hole that destroyed journalists' credibility. But curiosity won. He took the tape to an audio restoration specialist in Baltimore who digitized it for $200 and didn't ask questions. That night, Carter sat in his apartment with noise-cancelling headphones and pressed play. For the first minute, nothing but static and distant voices. Then clearer, military radio traffic, terse commands, acknowledgements. Someone was intercepting operational communications in real time. At timestamp 1413, an American voice cut through. "Shadow 7 to Cyan Control. Phase 2 parameters confirmed. Frequency modulation holding at 7.83 Hz. Standing by for sequence initiation." Carter stopped the playback, rewound it, listened again. American voice. American military radio protocol. Speaking about a phase sequence moments before the attack began. He kept listening. At 1416, the sound changed. Loud cracks, metallic impacts, screaming. The attack had begun. Through the chaos, another American voice, older, strained. "Cyan Control, this is Liberty Actual. We are under fire. We are a United States vessel. Cease fire! Cease fire!" That voice was familiar. Carter paused the recording and pulled up archival footage of Liberty survivors on YouTube. Commander William McGonigal, the ship's captain, giving testimony before Congress in 1982, the same voice. But according to all historical accounts, McGonigal had been on the bridge, fully exposed, with no radio equipment. He'd communicated through the bridge circuit, which had been destroyed in the first minutes of the attack, so how was he on this recording, speaking on a secure frequency that shouldn't have existed? Carter listened to the entire 75 minutes. The attack unfolded in real time. The aircraft, the torpedo boats, the screams, the chaos. And beneath it all, periodically cutting through, those calm American voices. Maintain visual lock, phase progression nominal, data collection continuing. At timestamp 1528, just before the attacking forces withdrew, one final transmission. Cyan Control to all stations, phase termination in 60 seconds, secure all data collection equipment. Shadow 7, confirm recording status. Recording complete, 73 minutes of continuous sensor data. Phase cancellation maintained throughout engagement. Excellent. Return to station. Operation Cyan Wave is concluded. Then silence. Carter sat in the darkness of his apartment, heart pounding. He just listened to evidence of a classified US military operation targeting one of its own ships. Not mistaken identity, not accidental friendly fire, a test. He needed verification. He needed someone who'd understand the technical implications, someone with intelligence community experience. He thought about that note's warning. They're still using it. Using what? Radar spoofing technology? This Cyan Wave system? Carter spent the next week researching. He found Linda Baker's name in declassified NSA documents about Liberty, one of the analysts who'd reviewed the intercepts. She'd be in her 90s now if she was still alive. A record search found her in Arlington, Virginia, age 94, still alive. He called her number. She answered on the fourth ring. "Mrs. Baker, my name is Evan Carter. I'm a journalist in Washington. I have a recording I think you need to hear." "What kind of recording?" "It's labelled Cyan Wave Intercept, from June 8th, 1967. The line went silent for so long Carter thought she'd hung up. "Come to my house tomorrow," Baker said finally. Come alone, bring the recording. Arlington, Virginia, the next day. Linda Baker's home was a small ranch house in a quiet neighbourhood, the yard immaculately maintained, American flag on the porch. Carter knocked, and she answered immediately, a tiny woman with sharp eyes and hands gnarled by arthritis. "Mr. Carter, come in." Her living room was neat, military precise, walls covered with framed photographs. A younger Baker in the 1960s professional attire, posed with colleagues outside Fort Meade. Citations for distinguished service. A shadow box with medals. Carter set up his laptop and played the recording. Baker listened with her eyes closed, hands folded in her lap. When McGonagall's voice came through, "Cyan Control, this is Liberty Actual," her eyes opened sharply. "That's not possible," she whispered. Carter paused the playback. "What's not possible?" "That voice. That's Commander McGonagall. I heard his testimony before Congress. But he couldn't have been transmitting on that frequency. The bridge communications were destroyed. Unless... Unless what?" Baker stood slowly and walked to a bookshelf. She removed a thick photo album and opened it, revealing not photographs but papers, decades-old documents, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. "I kept copies," she said. "Things I wasn't supposed to keep. Things I thought might matter someday." She showed Carter the 1967 memo referencing the 7.83 Hz frequency spikes, the budget document listing sine wave funding, the patent application for electromagnetic signature modulation. It was a test, Baker said. They were testing radar spoofing technology, making ships appear and disappear on radar screens by manipulating extremely low-frequency electromagnetic fields. Liberty's sensors were sophisticated enough to detect it, to record it, so they had to eliminate the evidence. By attacking their own ship, by creating a plausible cover story, a regional conflict, mistaken identity, fog of war. The attackers, whoever they actually were, could claim confusion. The US government accepts the explanation to protect its weapons program. 34 dead sailors become classified collateral damage. Carter felt sick. But the recording, McGonagall's voice. How? Two possibilities, Baker said. Either there were two separate communication streams, one real, one for the test control, or the recording itself is partially fabricated. Someone created a comprehensive audio record of the operation for documentation purposes, splicing together real combat recordings with test control transmissions. Who would do that? The NSA, DARPA, the Office of Naval Intelligence. Any agency running a black budget program that needs to document results without creating discoverable evidence. Carter thought about the anonymous note. They're still using it. "Mrs. Baker, if this technology existed in 1967, what would it look like now? 58 years of development?" Baker smiled grimly. "Stealth technology, active radar cancellation, electronic warfare systems that can make fighter jets invisible, ships disappear, missiles appear where they aren't. Every major military on Earth now uses descendants of what they tested that day. Can you prove any of this? Not in a way that would hold up in court, not in a way that would force declassification. The people who ordered it are dead. The paper trail is fragments and redactions. All we have are patterns and implications." Carter gestured at his laptop. "We have this recording." "Do we? Where did it come from? Who sent it? Could be authentic. Could be disinformation designed to surface and be debunked, discrediting everyone who takes it seriously. That's how intelligence agencies protect secrets, not by hiding them, but by surrounding them with so much noise that the truth becomes indistinguishable from paranoia." They sat in silence. "What do I do with this?" Carter asked finally. "What every journalist does. You tell the story. You let people decide what they believe. But understand, if you publish this, you'll be attacked, called a conspiracy theorist. Your credibility will be questioned. Sources will dry up. And if the recording is real, if there really are people still using this technology, they won't be happy that you've exposed it." Carter looked at the old woman across from him, someone who'd kept these secrets for nearly 60 years, waiting for the right moment. "Why didn't you go public, back in 1967 or any time since?" "Because I wasn't brave enough," Baker said simply, "and because I wasn't sure it would matter. The world had moved on. The technology proliferated. What would exposing it accomplish except my own destruction? Then why help me now? Because I'm 94 years old and dying. Because 34 sailors deserve better than being written off as collateral damage in a mistaken identity incident. And because someone sent you that recording for a reason, maybe it's time for the truth. Act 5. The Modern Implication. 3 months later. Evan Carter published his story in The Atlantic. Operation Cyan Wave. New evidence suggests USS Liberty attack was classified US weapons test. The response was immediate and polarised. Survivors of the Liberty attack and their families praised the article. Military historians debated its implications. Intelligence community veterans appeared on news programmes to denounce it as baseless speculation. The Pentagon declined to comment. Carter received death threats. He also received calls from 3 former NSA analysts who claimed they'd seen similar frequency anomalies in other classified operations from the Cold War era. None would go on record. 2 weeks after publication, Carter received a formal letter from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence requesting he turn over the original recording for authentication analysis. He declined through his lawyer, citing source protection. The story faded from the news cycle after a month. Some things are too old, too buried, too protected by institutional inertia to ever fully surface. But Carter kept digging. He found the patent Linda Baker had mentioned. US Patent 5159703. Method and apparatus for electromagnetic signature modulation. Filed in 1970, granted in 1992. The inventors, Richard Kellerman, Raytheon Advanced Systems, David Morse, DARPA Research Division, and Thomas Chen, Naval Research Laboratory. The patent described using extremely low-frequency electromagnetic pulses to create phase cancellation of radar return signals, making objects invisible to radar detection. Commercial application: stealth technology for military aircraft and naval vessels. The patent cited prior research from 1965 to 1967, but didn't name the project. Carter found academic papers from the 1980s and 90s discussing the Schumann resonance, that's 7.83 Hz frequency, and its potential military applications. Theoretical work on using Earth's natural electromagnetic field as a carrier signal for undetectable communications or radar manipulation. He found a 2003 Defense Advanced Research Project's agency request for proposals. Iron field stabilization, active phase defense systems for next-generation electronic warfare. The technology had never stopped developing. Whatever they tested on Liberty in 1967 had evolved into the cutting edge of modern military technology. The secret had been protected not just to avoid accountability for an attack, but to preserve a strategic advantage that was still relevant today. Arlington National Cemetery, November 2025. On a cold afternoon, 58 years after the attack, the US Navy unveiled a memorial plaque for the USS Liberty at Arlington National Cemetery. A small ceremony, attended by aging survivors, family members, and a handful of Navy officials. Linda Baker attended in a wheelchair, oxygen tank at her side. She watched as a Marine Honor Guard presented the colours, and a Navy chaplain offered prayers for the dead. When the ceremony ended, a man in civilian clothes approached her. Late 50s, grey suit, no identifying credentials. "Mrs. Baker? I'm with the Office of Naval Intelligence, thank you for attending." "Did you know them?" "The men who died?" "No, ma'am. Before my time, but I wanted to thank you personally." "For what?" "For your service. For your discretion over the years. For helping close an old file." Baker looked at him sharply. "I didn't close anything. The journalist's story is still out there." The man smiled. "Stories fade. Conspiracy theories multiply and discredit themselves. What matters is that the institutional memory remains consistent. Tragic accident. Mistaken identity. Fog of war. Some things are better left under the waterline where they belong." He handed her a business card, blank except for a phone number. "If you ever need anything, Mrs. Baker, the Navy takes care of its own." He walked away before she could respond. That night, Baker sat in her living room, too tired to sleep. She thought about Mark Reynolds, whoever he was now, whatever had happened to him. She thought about the men who died on liberty. She thought about all the secrets she'd kept and all the years that had passed. Her computer chimed. Incoming email. The sender address was a random string of characters, no subject line. She opened it. The message contained only 2 lines of text and an audio file attachment. Echo phase reactivated. Frequency 7.83 Hz detected. Eastern Med Array. Baker's hand trembled as she clicked the attachment. A waveform appeared on her screen. Audio data, time-stamped from the earlier that day. She plugged in her headphones and pressed play. At first, nothing. White noise. The hiss of distant ocean monitoring equipment. Then, gradually emerging from the background, a low rhythmic pulse. Steady. Measured. Precisely 7.83 Hz. The same frequency she detected 58 years ago. The pulse continued for 30 seconds, growing slightly louder, more distinct, and beneath it so faint she had to turn the volume to maximum. Something else. Not random noise. Pattern. Structure. Multiple voices overlapped and distorted, speaking in fragments. Phase alignment confirmed. Target lock acquired. Maintain visual until... Cyan control. Baker's breath caught. These weren't recordings from 1967. The audio quality was too clean, too digital. This was new, current, happening right now. She checked the timestamp again. November 15th, 2025, 1413 UTC. The exact same time the Liberty attack had begun, 58 years earlier, 1413 local time in the Eastern Mediterranean. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Someone was running the system again, in the same location, at the same time, either as a test, a demonstration, or an actual operation. The audio file continued playing. The pulse grew stronger, more insistent, until it began to synchronize with something else, a deeper rhythm, slower, familiar. It took her a moment to recognize it. A heartbeat, human heartbeat rhythm, approximately 60 beats per minute. The electromagnetic pulse was modulating to match it, as if the technology itself had evolved to interface with biological rhythms, making it harder to distinguish from natural background noise. The sound built, layering upon itself, electromagnetic pulse, human heartbeat, those fragmented voices, all blending into a single resonant frequency that made Baker's chest feel tight, her own heart seeming to synchronize with the rhythm coming through her headphones. At exactly 60 seconds, the audio cut out. Silence. Baker sat frozen, headphones still on, staring at her computer screen. The email had already disappeared from her inbox. She checked her deleted folder, her spam folder. Nothing. As if it had never existed. But the audio file was still on her desktop, and she tried to open it again. The file was corrupted, 0 bytes, unreadable. Someone had sent her evidence of an active operation and then remotely erased it, leaving her with nothing but memory and the knowledge that after 58 years, Cyan Wave wasn't history. It was still operational, still secret, still being used somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean at this very moment. Baker closed her laptop and sat in the darkness of her living room. Outside, a cold November wind rattled the windows. The American flag on her porch snapped and rippled. She thought about those 34 sailors, about Mark Reynolds and his stolen tape, about Commander McGonagall standing on that bridge refusing to abandon his post, even as his ship was destroyed around him. She thought about all the secrets she'd kept, all the years of silence and whether any of it had mattered. Her phone sat on the table beside her. She could call Carter, tell him about the email, the audio, the active signal, but what would that accomplish? Another story that would be denied, debunked, dismissed. Or she could do nothing, let it go, die with her secrets intact, having spent her whole life in the shadows of classified operations. Baker picked up the phone. She dialed Carter's number. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Baker, are you okay? It's almost midnight." "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "they're running it again. Right now, same location, same time. I just received proof." "Received from who?" "I don't know. Someone who wants me to know, or wants to see what I'll do with the information." "Do you still have the proof?" "No." It erased itself, but I heard it, Evan, that frequency, those voices. It's not historical, it's active. Right now. Carter was silent for a moment. What do you want me to do? I want you to keep digging. Keep asking questions. Don't let them bury it for another 58 years. Those men deserve better. The truth deserves better. And you? What will you do? Baker looked at the blank business card from the O&I officer, still sitting on her coffee table. I'm going to make a phone call, she said. I'm going to tell them I know. And then I'm going to sleep better than I have in 58 years. They might... I'm 94 years old and dying of cancer, Evan. What are they going to do? The only power they have over me is silence. And I'm done being silent. She hung up before he could argue. Baker sat for a long time, holding that blank business card, thinking about consequences and courage and the weight of truth. Finally, at 12:47 a.m, she dialed the number. It rang once. A voice answered. Male, neutral, professional. Yes? This is Linda Baker. Someone wanted me to know that sine wave is still active. I'm calling to tell you that I know. I've always known. And now someone else knows too. Silence on the line then. Mrs. Baker, I think you may be confused. Perhaps. I'm not confused. I was there from the beginning. I saw the frequency data. I kept the documents. And tonight I heard the same pulse, live, from the Eastern Mediterranean. You can deny it, classify it, bury it under 50 more years of secrecy, but you can't stop the truth from eventually surfacing. Another pause. When the voice returned, it was colder. The truth, Mrs. Baker, is complicated. National security requires difficult decisions. Sometimes the greater good demands sacrifice. Tell that to the 34 men who died. They'll sacrifice advanced American defensive capabilities that have protected thousands of lives since. Would you undo that? I would have found another way. One that didn't require killing our own sailors. There was no other way. And if you truly believed what you're saying, you would have gone public decades ago. But you didn't. Because you understand the necessity of secrets. Baker closed her eyes. He was right. She'd had 58 years to speak. She'd chosen silence. Until now. You're right, she said softly. I should have spoken sooner. But I can end my life having finally told the truth. Sine wave happened. It's still happening. And people deserve to know. No one will believe you without proof. And you have none. Maybe. But I'm not the only one who knows anymore. And eventually secrets always surface. Good night, Mrs. Baker. Thank you for your service. The line went dead. Baker set down the phone and exhaled slowly. Her heart was racing. She felt more alive than she had in years. She'd done it. Finally, after all this time, she'd confronted the people who'd buried the truth for 6 decades. Outside, a car started somewhere on her street. Engine noise, headlights briefly washing across her windows, then darkness again. If they were watching, let them watch. She'd said what needed to be said. Baker went to bed and slept deeply for the first time in 58 years. Epilogue. 6 months later, May 2026. Linda Baker died peacefully in her sleep on May 3rd, 2026 at the age of 94. Her obituary in the Washington Post mentioned her distinguished career at the National Security Agency and her contributions to signals intelligence during the Cold War. It did not mention USS Liberty or Sine Wave. Evan Carter attended her funeral in Arlington. A military honor guard was present. Several elderly former NSA colleagues paid their respects. The O&I officer in the grey suit stood in the back, watching. After the service, Carter found a manila envelope on his car windshield, secured under the wiper blade. Inside, a USB drive and a handwritten note in Linda Baker's shaky script, dated 2 weeks before her death. Mr. Carter, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Enclosed is everything I kept over the years. Documents, audio files, analysis. Use your judgment. Some truths are worth the cost, some aren't. You'll have to decide. But decide honestly. Don't let fear make the choice for you. Those sailors died for a secret. Make sure their deaths meant something. LB. Carter plugged the USB drive into his laptop that night. Hundreds of files. Scanned documents from the 1960s and 70s. audio recordings, technical analyses, Linda Baker's complete archive of everything she'd learned about Operation Cyan Wave. At the bottom of the directory, one video file for Evan.mp4. He clicked it. Linda Baker appeared on screen, sitting in her living room, clearly unwell but sharp-eyed. The timestamp showed it had been recorded 3 days before her death. "Hello, Evan," she said. "If you're watching this, I kept my promise to myself. I died, having told the truth. Everything on this drive is real. Cyan Wave existed. It was tested on Liberty. 34 men died to protect it, and it's still being used today. You have a choice now. Publish this and face the consequences, or put it away and let the secret stay buried. I can't tell you what to do. But I can tell you this. Those sailors didn't have a choice. They were sacrificed by people who saw them as expendable. The least we owe them is the truth. Whatever you decide, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for giving an old woman the courage to finally do the right thing." She smiled sadly. "Good luck, Evan. The truth is a heavy burden, but it's the only thing worth carrying." The video ended. Carter sat in silence, the weight of decision pressing down on him. Outside, Washington, D.C. hummed with the machinery of government, agencies and institutions and classified programs operating in shadows, protecting secrets that might be vital or might be criminal. He thought about Linda Baker, about Mark Reynolds, about Commander McGonagall and 34 sailors who died in the Mediterranean. He thought about truth and consequences, about secrecy and accountability. Then he opened a new document and began to write. The title appeared, Operation Cyan Wave, The Complete Story. Whether he would publish it, whether the world would ever read it, whether the truth would be more than fragments and implications, that remained uncertain. But at least now someone knew, someone had listened, someone was carrying the burden forward, and somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, at precisely 14:13 local time, a low-frequency pulse cycled through the electromagnetic spectrum at 7.83 Hz, detected by satellites and monitoring stations, part of a system that had never stopped evolving, never stopped operating, never stopped echoing across the decades since that June afternoon in 1967. The sound built, layered with meaning and memory. It matched a human heartbeat. It faded into silence, and the world moved on, carrying its secrets, waiting for the day when truth would surface, not as conspiracy but as history, when those 34 sailors would receive something more than a memorial plaque, waiting for the echoes to finally be heard,